Welcome back to the channel. This is Trinity Storm, and you are watching What If Fem-Naruto Was Forcefully Sent Back in Time by Madara. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Now, wasting no more time, let's start the story.
Sasuke was unsure of what to anticipate as he stood in the ruins of his clan's shrine and faced the four resurrected Hokage. A familiar strum of rage ran through his bones at the sight of the third, the one who gave Itachi the order to massacre everyone and become a pariah, but he chose to ignore it, as if he also made an effort to overlook the first's eccentricities. He glanced toward the fourth, and his eyes widened a little. There was no question in his mind that he was looking at Naruto's father because of the striking similarity. The spiked hair, the eyes, the same high cheekbones, and the exact coloring of the skin and hair. He wondered if Naruto's father was the person who sealed the demon inside her, the hero she had known for almost her whole childhood. He concentrated on the cage as a whole, trying to ignore thoughts of her because they were constantly distracting and something he couldn't afford at the moment. After a few minutes, Sasuke was left to watch with caution as the second Hokage's resurrected body approached the shrine's wall and touched it. He was aware that he was no match for the power that he and the first Hokage had directed at him. If he was alone, perhaps the Nidaime, but he couldn't have both. Since he had good self-preservation instincts, he was relieved that the first appeared to be able to control his brother. He really didn't want to know what would have happened if the second had lowered his finger. Things changed after the cage was informed of the war and that Naruto was battling two equally potent chakras. Naruto's chakra was strong, warm, and enhanced by the fox, but it was not under its control. Even those without senses could obviously feel them, even though they were miles away. Even where they were, there were still sporadic explosions that rocked the ground, but nothing approached the village. Curiosity was piqued once more by the second's expression as he extended his senses in the almost desperate way he pressed his body against the wall, but he remained silent. Particularly hostile to him personally appeared to be the first and second. He was good at reading people, but they were good at hiding it. The first said, "Tobirama, not yet," as he turned to look at his brother. The second's jaw tightened as he turned to face his brother with red, irate eyes. "Ni." The first repeated, "She will be fine. You know this," in an attempt to talk sense into his brother's head. "You think I don't want to help her?" Only because Orochimaru controlled his body did Sasuke suspect the second Hokage was still here, even though he had no idea who the man was so eager to see. Sasuke listened to the first story after Orochimaru regained the cage's interest. He knew all the while that, despite their outward displays of composure, the first, second, and fourth Hokage were eager to go to battle. And as he listened to them, he couldn't help but feel that their account of the past was missing something. In order to process the memories of the clone confronting the real Madara, Naruto used the time she had while running to meet the fake Madara. She winced as she was given the memories of the clones she had supporting Gaara's business. The real Madara Uchiha had returned to life and was using taijutsu primarily to virtually destroy the Alliance's shinobi on his own. He was able to easily turn the weapons and attacks of seasoned shinobi against one another, and one of his ninjutsu took nearly a dozen shinobi to counter. As well as bringing down meteors. Many of them perished as a result of being greatly outclassed against him. What she remembered most was the expression on the Uchiha's face when he first saw her clone. When he first saw her, his eyes widened slightly, and then he smiled eerily. He had been speaking with the resurrected Tsuchikage, and her clones had seen the knowing, almost affectionate smile he had given her when she had held off the wood style. She forced herself to concentrate on battling the resurrected Jinchuriki, forcing herself to forget the way Madara had gazed at her clone. She needed to have faith that Tsunade and Gaara were capable. She couldn't do everything by herself, as Itachi mentioned. She was thankful despite all the revelations she had to deal with during the battle against the Biju and the now exposed Obito. Learning Kurama's name at Euro, and all of their names at Euro, made her happy, and she was thankful that she had the opportunity to speak with other Biju and their hosts. Within a few minutes, her relationship with the fox had essentially taken a completely different turn, but they were now cooperating, and she believed that this would give them a better chance of turning the tide in their favor. When Madara reappeared on her battlefield, she immediately thought of him again. When he arrived, she was upset and anxious because it meant he had vanquished Gaara, Tsunade Chan, and the other cage. She was distracted by Kakashi Sensei's worry for them and her disarray over Obito, but she continued to pay close attention to Madara despite his irritating and provocative remarks. In that instant of silence, when he and her clone were just inches apart before he redirected her attack back on her, he spoke to her clone while his piercing Rinnegan was pinned on her real self under Octo. "Pops." This was after her clone attacked him with the Rasengan and his Gunbai absorbed it. She was scared and angry all at once when she was given the memory after it had been dispelled. "I found you, Naruto." It seemed to Naruto that he was not referring to her being a Jinchuriki and achieving his objective. His tone seemed too intimate and overly enthusiastic to be solely focused on locating Kurama's Jinchuriki. Every encounter she had with the Uchiha actually felt too intimate. It seemed like he knew just what to say to make her angry. He appeared to anticipate her moves and knew how to counter them, so he was never taken aback by anything she threw at him. She questioned how he seemed to know her so well, given that she had only learned a few of her moves a few hours prior to her and Kurama agreeing to collaborate. She had the unshakable impression that he was playing with her, waiting for a certain moment before making contact. Even when she stood up for Kakashi-sensei and concentrated on the 10 tails, he just sat out of the battle, but his eyes were burning into her the entire time. He never spoke to her in the same way that he had spoken to her clone, and she forced herself to ignore her perplexity when Kurama urged her to concentrate on the fight. She knew she didn't want Madara to get his hands on her, regardless of what transpired over the next few hours. Naturally, things did not turn out the way she had hoped. The people closest to her saw that he was looking at her when reinforcements arrived and remained close to her while Madara and Obito tried their best to eliminate the shinobi and win her over to their cause. Since she was aware that they would have to kill her in order to obtain Kurama, she questioned why they were attempting to persuade her to join them. That deal would not be accepted by anyone with a self-preservation instinct, and she did have one, though it was questionable. Now that she was capable of experiencing negative emotions, she felt that the Uchiha Patriarch was not expressing any of them. The only negative feelings emanating from him were sporadic outbursts of irritation. Madara was almost eager and excited as he allowed Obito to try to influence her, even though she could tell that every word and action she made was getting under Obito's skin. Unfortunately for Madara, he killed Neji in an attempt to persuade her to join him. Even though she was on the verge of breaking, Hinata helped her and the army organize for another assault at Euro, something she realized didn't come as a huge surprise to Madara. Madara used all of her senses to try to feel what was causing him to get so excited when she pulled out and felt a wave of rage, hate, and excitement. She sensed 4 strong chakra sources, 2 of which she identified as her father and, after some memory retrieval, Sarutobi, Gigi. She expanded her search further and found Sasuke's chakra with 3 others, one of which she instantly recognized as Orochimaru. She knew the other 2 strongest must be the other Hokage. She was annoyed that the Sannin had survived, but she concentrated on keeping Madara and Obito at bay until they arrived because she knew the cage would assist once Sasuke had what he wanted. Unfortunately, he returned his focus to Madara tenfold after the other cage's resurrection appeared to trigger something in her. Even though he was sitting out of the fighting, his intense gaze on her was a huge distraction. She knew they would eventually receive the assistance they required as soon as she felt the cage and Sasuke heading to the battlefield. Knowing where she got her dramatic flair from, she couldn't help but smile at her father's entrance as she enjoyed seeing him in person rather than just as a mental construct of chakra. She was amazed to see the Shodiami and Naidame, but they both looked at her with too much recognition and joy for her to ignore, especially the second Hokage. When they saw how exhausted she was, how her arm was limp and bleeding, and how her clothes were ripped beyond repair, they almost seemed concerned, but that didn't make sense. Both of them had passed away long before she was even born, so they had never met before. Kurama also paid attention, and she could hear him muttering to himself while he attempted to solve the problem. Even he realized that something else had to be happening here after 3 significant historical figures appeared too excited to see her. She angrily spat a strand of hair out of her face, ignoring Sasuke and his declaration completely. Her hair had fallen out of its braid hours earlier, leaving her surrounded by a tangled mess, but she couldn't take the time to put it up. She didn't currently have the time or desire to deal with him. Even though she had been attempting to bring him home for nearly 4 years, she still harbored resentment toward him for all of his actions. Even though she was glad he was back with them, he was a complete and utter ass, even though she thought of him as her brother and best friend. After the cage sealed the 10 tails behind the barrier, the battle took an unexpected turn. The one battling Hashirama's clones was Madara's clone, which she had somehow created. She was unaware of this until he had swiftly slipped past the shinobi forces, grabbed her in his arms, and then whipped her away to the location where his clone and Hashirama's were vanquished following a decisive battle. Madara had clones holding everyone else back while he held on to her, while the other Hokage were trapped in one spot because of the barrier. One arm held her shoulders and pressed tightly across her chest, while the other wrapped around her waist like a band, pinning her arms down. He drew her near to him, crushing her against his armor with iron-like hands. Stretched across the front of his armor with her feet hanging down, she was so close that her lips would have touched his ear had she turned her head. She attempted to fight her way out, but she was powerless in this situation and he outperformed her in terms of sheer physical strength. Though she had no idea what it would do, she saw seals arranged in a pattern resembling her old seal with a spiral in the center. Evidently, Kurama, who could see right through her eyes, did, and she sensed that he became quiet as he concentrated on collecting his chakra. Panicked and confused, she tried to fight her way out of his hold using the chakra she had. He had no trouble batting away her resistance. After hours of fighting and sharing her chakra, she was exhausted, and despite her attempts to push off using his body, she was unable to gain any leverage. Because of the way he had pinned her arms and waist, she was unable to raise her legs sufficiently. She could only attempt to kick at his shins and knees. When she felt his chakra begin to flow into her body from the points they were connected to, she bit back a scream, her struggles coming to an immediate halt. It gathered at a spot on the back of her shoulder, flared painfully, then settled, burning inside her. He looked down to where his chakra had settled, and she felt his breath on her back as the hand by her throat grabbed the collar of her shirt and pulled it away. He pushed her into the seal after apparently finding what he was looking for. It began glowing instantly and rapidly depleting her chakra. In an attempt to prevent her from being drained dry, Kurama used the chakra he had collected and forced it out. She was on her hands and knees in a matter of seconds as the seal began to glow and whatever was on her back began to burn. All of her senses were focused on Madara as he kneeled outside the formation closest to her, even though she could hear everyone shouting and fighting and no one could get through her clones. As the seal used her and Kurama's chakra to communicate with him, she was able to ignore her mounting fatigue. Are you doing? His face changed, almost softening, but it still had the same eager light from before, with his back to everyone but her. I'm following history. She fell onto her stomach, face turned to him, too tired to support herself any longer. As Madara began adding his chakra to the seal, she was immobilized and utterly bewildered. Whatever was on her back throbbed in steady waves, synchronizing with the seal, but she was too tired to scream. Kurama didn't help her and was oddly silent, but before she could ask him what he was doing, the seal began to glow and change around her, flowing into a spiral that resembled Kakashi's Kamui. Naruto felt Kurama pull on her mind in the same way that he had when she allowed him to take control and she eventually blacked out without resisting. As soon as Tobirama and Hashirama felt Naruto's chakra after being resurrected, they knew what would happen. Hashirama was aware that Tobirama had much more motivation for traveling to the battlefield than just destroying Madara and defending the village. He wanted to see her, as did his younger brother. Only Hashirama could tell that Tobirama had changed after sensing her chakra. The warmest aspect of Tobirama that the blonde Spitfire had revealed had been buried when Naruto was transported back to their present time, and his younger brother had grown stern and icy, which only made him, Mito, and his genin team more tolerant. His brother was already sufficiently weakened by the mere sensation of her chakra once more for Hashirama to prevent him from murdering Sasuke. For once, he was the one with common sense, even though he wanted to beat the boy's face for what he had done to Naruto. When the Ten Tails chakra exploded and the sound of widespread devastation reached their ears, they had all left Sasuke behind. As they all rushed forward, he had shook his head and glanced at his fellow Kage. Only Naruto was able to encircle so many significant and influential people with her finger. While Hashirama, Tobi, and Saru were at most 5 minutes behind, Minato had sprinted ahead, demonstrating his remarkable speed and advancements in his younger brother's technique. He was unsure of how to feel about Naruto's father. He was aware that circumstances had been against him at Naruto's birth, but he was still a little upset about everything he had done to leave her to handle on her own, even though it wasn't intentional. Knowing Naruto had no ill will toward him, he made the decision to hold off on making a decision for the time being. When they got there, Hashirama noticed his brother's anguish and longing when Naruto looked at him unfamiliarly, and he experienced similar feelings. Additionally, he suppressed some guilt because he knew Naruto would be extremely terrified in the coming minutes. When the Senju brothers and Madara first arrived on the field, they all had the same expression at Yuro. One that was filled with hatred in the case of Tobi and Madara, but one that was nonetheless mutually agreeable. They would allow the past to unfold and then sell everything when she was pulled back, but they wouldn't stop what would happen. In order to safely take Naruto and return her at the appropriate time, Madara and Hashirama's clones set up the seals under the pretense of a pitiful battle. They were able to do it without any issues because the Shinobi Alliance was too preoccupied with Naruto and the Jubi to give them much thought. However, Hashirama was relieved that they were confined while maintaining the barrier. It had been extremely close for both Tobirama and Minato to stay in their positions and go to Naruto after Madara had grabbed her. He had to suppress a smile as he recalled their time with Naruto and considered what was going to happen. He was one of the few people she confided in about practically everything, and she had been one of his closest friends. But he was no longer able to make any predictions. He had no idea how long it would be before she returned, but at least he knew Madara would at least slow down his plans until then, if not completely stop them. The sight of Naruto disappearing was causing the shinobi to panic and give in to their rage and panic, and he knew that before they attempted to battle Madara, they needed to be informed of what was going on. He glanced at the assembled shinobi and grinned once more. It was not surprising to him that Naruto could bring the entire shinobi world together behind her, even though he was the one who brought the clans together to build Konoha and lay the foundation for the 5 great nations. Hashirama gave Madara's missing accomplice some thought. The only wild card was him. He appeared to be in a hurry with the 10 tails, and it was impossible to tell how much he knew. The other one might not be waiting for Naruto, but he could rely on Madara to be. He was currently busy somewhere else, but as soon as he made himself known once more, Hashirama would be ready. They had to try to keep him and the 10 tails under control until she returned. Although space seals were challenging, he sincerely hoped that not much time would pass here. Watching Madara and the 10 tails, he drew the attention of the allied shinobi and flared his chakra at them, particularly the teenagers, to get them to stop. At the sensation of his chakra, the shinobi turned to face him and froze. "Hey, she's fine, I'll explain everything, do not attack, is that clear?" Upon seeing those seals through Naruto's eyes, Kurama immediately recognized them and understood that the strange looks Naruto was receiving during the battles were due to the fact that Madara and the Senju were familiar with her. They were following the history they knew and had previously met her. After everything was ready, he took over the pullback in time by dragging Naruto's consciousness into her mindscape. He pulled her as deep into her mind as he could to protect her while he took control, keeping her body and mind intact until the seal ran its course, because no human mind, no matter how strong, can withstand the trauma of time travel. He was aware that he would need to prevent her from making excessive attempts to alter the past. He would find it difficult to stop her from pursuing Madara, but she was sent back to maintain consistency rather than drastically alter the past. No matter how much time passed, nothing would be settled between the people she encountered until she returned to her own era. He was betting that she would spend a lot of time in their time, based on the feelings they had experienced from Madara and the Senju brothers. Naruto appeared to be particularly attached to the water brat. She would persuade the Senju brothers to train her, hopefully. Since that snake Kabuto had brought him back to life in his prime using all the skills he had acquired up until his actual death, he needed any advantage over Madara. They eventually find out, or she tells them her predicament, because they appear to care for her so much and were not shocked to see her after their resurrection. Kurama ensured that Naruto's mind was unharmed by the seal finishing's pull. Too inhuman to suffer too much harm, he had hardly noticed the seal's effects. The rapid drain of chakra was mostly felt by him. They were calmly deposited by the seal. Her body was placed in the same spot where the seal had finished, and the pattern of seals just unfolded like a spiral on the ground. He assumed the seal was based in some way on the Kamui, Hitaki and Uchiha's Sharingan, since there were no explosions or huge releases of chakra to evoke movement. He had to acknowledge Madara and Hashirama. They had worked together to create a recreate. Tenses were going to be a pain in the ass, a seal that would serve its purpose without causing Naruto any harm and without drawing attention to herself. The only damage to her body had been from severe chakra exhaustion and burns, but those were temporary. Kurama cautiously raised Naruto's body, keeping an eye out for any adversaries. They were either from the early days of the village's founding or the Warring States era, both of which were still marked by hostility and suspicion. Before allowing Naruto to take charge, he kept her repressed not severely, while she was still unconscious to ensure that she was at least out of the open and close to familiar territory. He had enough faith in his intuition to conclude that they were, in fact, quite near to Konoha's current or future location. He detected no nearby chakra signatures or the intense emotions that are typical of humans, and they were entirely encircled by forest. Even if he used her body, he knew that this could change at any time and that Naruto couldn't be caught using his chakra. Until Hashirama freed him from Madara to be sealed and located the rest of his kin to distribute them among the villages, there was no Jinchuriki or use of the Biju. After meeting the Senju and Madara, Naruto made the decision to at least learn the brothers' whereabouts, if not meet them directly. They were a far safer option than taking her straight to Madara, and their age would give him some time. Considering the dangers of the era, he tore Naruto's leaf emblem from her head and removed the remnants of her kimono top, which had the Uzumaki swirl on the back. He took out the storage scrolls Jiraiya had given her and looked through them until he found her simple, free dark orange jacket with a black lining. She was now wearing a black shirt and jacket over torn black shinobi pants with mesh armor. No distinguishing marks. He removed the remaining clothing from the scroll, removing all of the tops in the kimono style that mirrored Kushina's fashion as well as anything else that featured the leaf or Uzumaki symbol. This left just one outfit, along with her underwear and sleepwear. Rather than placing the headband and clothing in the scroll, he concealed them far beneath a tree's roots. When she was located, the clothing in her scroll would be searched. Naruto looked at the seal, knowing that he would now be viewed as nothing more than a clanless orphan. The dark black markings stood out against the grass like a brand, and it didn't seem to be going away. He made an attempt to tilt Naruto's head so that she could see the spot on her shoulder where Madara had done something. He was unable to see the entire seal, but he could see its edge. He directed a tiny portion of his chakra toward it to test his suspicions. He sensed a tiny pulse, but the tiny seal showed no outward signs of reaction. Another pulse reacted from the seal on the ground. Large quantities of Madara's chakra, which he had most likely been accumulating since his resurrection, were contained in the timer seal that he had burned on Naruto's body. Naruto would remain in the past until that chakra was exhausted. The seal on Naruto would be activated when the allotted time was up, and it would pulse until Naruto arrived. The second seal on Naruto served only to key the seal to her, allowing her to be the only one drawn through time. In both seals, Madara's chakra served as an anchor, drawing her to a particular moment in time, a euro. That is, when he was Olivia Euro, as long as it was active. A brief examination of the main seal revealed that the chakra had been added to the seal network by Hashirama's clone, which had assisted in its layout. Because Madara was worse than a cockroach, Hashirama's chakra in the seal allowed Naruto to be transported back in time to when they were both alive. The only way he could conceal such a dangerous seal would be to attract attention, but it was too dangerous to leave it exposed. The seal was too dangerous, especially with Madara present, so weighing the risks was not a contest. Kurama swiftly collected his chakra and infused it with the chakra of the surrounding nature while crouching on the edge of the seal. He layered it over the seal quickly but carefully, knowing that the amount of chakra he was using was strong enough to be sensed by any sensors within a large radius of him. Like a genjutsu, he concealed the seal from view by covering it with his chakra, until he released the seal himself. The nature chakra, which also served to conceal his own, would nourish the chakra and conceal the seal. The seal would remain hidden from any curious red eyes, and the cloak would be indiscernible because it simply felt like nature. Kurama identified the senju after sensing two strong chakras heading straight for him. He was relieved that they were the only ones arriving because those two were among the best sensors ever created. Not wanting to call their attention to the spot where she had appeared in case they sensed any disturbance, he ran Naruto's body to the next clearing he could find. He moved into Naruto's head and let her body fall like a stone when he sensed that their chakra was near enough to locate her in a minute. Naruto was still unconscious, but he was still able to see what was going on around her by using his senses. He examined the brothers when they got there, doing his best to estimate their ages as they looked for potential dangers in the vicinity of Naruto. Hashirama and Tobirama sensed a very strong, potent chakra and ran swiftly through the forest in that direction. There was too much danger in those times to ignore a potential threat with that level of chakra. Since they sensed no other chakra following or approaching them, it appeared that only they had sensed it. The only reason they had detected it at all was because Tobirama had used his chakra while on patrol and had picked up the first hint of it. Hashirama and Tobirama accelerated as the chakra's source abruptly disappeared, keeping their senses sharp for even the smallest change in the chakra. There was still another source in the same direction, but the powerful one was no longer there. Before long, they reached a tiny clearing that was little more than a slightly wider space between two trees. A young girl, not even 20, was crumpled on her stomach at the base of one, apparently unconscious. Before approaching her, both of them used their senses to make sure she wasn't acting. Her chakra was extremely weak, but it was still and serene, with no alterations that would reveal her identity. She was unconscious. They remained motionless, crouching close to her in case she woke up, after Hashirama motioned for Tobirama to follow him to the ground. The first to move was Hashirama, who grabbed for her shoulder. "I'm going to see if she has any clan symbols on her." Hashirama was cautious as she examined her body, turning her over to check for any symbols and feeling for her pulse. She had only minor injuries and was not in danger of dying because her pulse was strong and steady. Although her clothing was somewhat ripped, he didn't see any clan symbols on her. He opened a weapon pouch he saw and discovered two small scrolls along with some kunai and shuriken. When he took both out and opened them, he discovered that they were storage scrolls with labels indicating what was in each section. The two scrolls were strewn with weapons, medical supplies, clothing, rations, and one that simply read, spare supplies. A tiny, hand-drawn image of a toad on the bottom of both scrolls was the most peculiar feature, but it wasn't particularly concerning. He put the girl down on her back and turned to his brother. She's alive, no injuries but some minor chakra burns and a severe case of chakra exhaustion. No clan marks on her clothes and her hair's too bright to be a Yamanaka. What do you think? Tobirama came closer to her now, his gaze fixed on her face with greater intensity than was customary in this circumstance. The girl was stunning, so Hashirama couldn't criticize his acting. Even though she still had a little round face from her youth, it was clear that her beauty would only increase with age. Her high cheekbones were accentuated by odd whisker marks on her cheeks, which he knew weren't scars. Her skin was a light golden tan, which accentuated the richness of her hair color, and her lips were full, pale pink, and slightly chapped. Her hair was loose and tangled around her, bright blonde. It appeared to have fallen out randomly after having been in a braid. Like Tobirama, she had spiked bangs that reached her elbows, but hers extended past her eyes, framing her face with slightly longer hair. Her attire was intriguing, particularly for a shinobi. She had bandages wrapped around her legs from just below her knees to the top of her black sandals, and she was dressed in black shinobi pants tucked into ninja sandals. Her right thigh had additional bandages on top of a weapons pouch. Under a plain black sleeveless shirt, he had thought she was wearing mid-sleeve mesh armor. The most peculiar aspect of her attire was the long-sleeved, dark orange jacket with pockets on the inside and outside. She had no additional armor, which is particularly risky for a shinobi in these times. When he turned her over, the only thing he had felt was the mesh beneath her shirt. Tobirama had squatted next to him and touched the girl's arm. Hashirama nodded to indicate that he had also sensed it as his younger brother's eyes widened and shot to him. He had sensed her chakra levels when he was in close proximity to her skin. Since there were so few kunoichi and the ones that were there were nowhere near as large as this girl's chakra reserves, they could both sense how large her chakra reserves were, even in the extreme state of exhaustion she was currently in. Her reserves are too large to be a civilian that someone trained. She naturally had large reserves growing up. Whoever trained her because they sensed this in her. She could possibly match me at her full strength, Tobirama subsequently disclosed. She's also at least half Uzumaki. Hashirama nodded, thinking that all Uzumaki had a clear tinge to their chakra, but he was perplexed by the absence of the red hair and clan symbol. Given the dangers of a woman traveling alone, the clan would have taken her in if she was, in fact, Uzumaki, even if she was only half. She was either hiding, unaware of her ancestry, or actively looking for the clan. They must not be aware of the girl's existence because Uzumaki and the Senju were close allies and he had never heard a hint of her existence. He had to consider the possibility that she might pose a threat, whether or not she was Uzumaki. It's too risky to take her back to the clan or the Uzumaki without knowing anything about her. Tobirama thought and squinted his eyes. We have the outpost to the east that has enough supplies. We can set her up there and keep her contained until she wakes and we can question her. I can watch her and notify you when she wakes. After giving it some thought, Hashirama nodded. Having constructed the outpost himself, he was familiar with it. It was essentially a cabin, fully furnished and sealed, where they went when they wanted to be by themselves. Tobirama would be better off staying there because he was there most when he wanted to be by himself or practice and develop his jutsu. Although he had to leave the clan and couldn't leave for unknown lengths of time without preparation, he would come when he could. In order for them to move swiftly, Tobirama leaned over and carefully placed the girl over his shoulder while being mindful of his armor. Hashirama followed his brother, putting the girl's supplies back in her weapon pouch and taking it with him. They reached the tiny cabin in 10 minutes at the speed they were capable of. It had only 3 small windows, solid walls, and a single visible story. Although there was only one door that was visible, they were the only ones aware of the underground tunnel, which served as an escape route in the unlikely event that the location was discovered and they were unable to blast their way out. There were just 2 rooms inside. There was a simple kitchen next to the fireplace, and a sleeping area in the far corner that was little more than a comfortable futon. There was a table and 2 chairs, but no other furnishings. The bathroom was the other room. It was the only one with walls, but if the door was open, anyone inside could see the entire cabin. Hashirama went to the table where some scrolls and ink were, while Tobirama placed the girl down on the futon. He picked up a brush and some new ink and knelt down next to the girl once more. His younger brother swiftly had a chakra suppression seal drawn on her arm using skillful strokes after pulling up her jacket and mesh sleeves to reveal her arm. It would prevent her from using her chakra, but it wouldn't prevent her from getting it back. His brother was looking through the kitchen and the wood supply when he turned to face him. "How long are you good for?" As he closed the cabinets, Tobirama remarked, "There is enough food for a few days plus hunting, same with the wood. What about you?" With a hand on the wall, Hashirama concentrated on inspecting the security seals. The seals are undisturbed and functioning. I will try to come every day to check on her progress. Depending on how much Uzumaki is in her, she should be up in a day or two. Tobirama took another look at the unconscious girl. "Are we going to contact them?" Hashirama sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "We should probably wait until she wakes and we can question her. Find out who exactly she is, where she comes from, and whether she's a threat before we tell them." Tobirama nodded while keeping his gaze fixed on the girl. Ignoring his younger brother's scowl, he walked over and threw an arm over his shoulders, smiling at the rare opportunity to make fun of his serious brother. "You can't take your eyes off her, Tobi-kun. I get it, she is rather." Tobirama glared at him darkly and shrugged off his arm, saying reproachfully, "Shut up." Before Tobirama pushed him, Hashirama lowered his head and shoulders, muttering, "Can't even have a bit of fun with my own brother," and pouting. Tobirama shoved him toward the door, clearly irritated. "Just go back to the clan. Come when you can tomorrow." He gave the unconscious girl a final glance before heading out with his brother. He hoped the girl wasn't a threat as he ran through the woods. Even though the majority of shinobi her age were essentially veterans, she was still quite young. She was in her mindscape, Naruto realized. She jumped and screamed when she opened her eyes. Kurama was crouching over her, observing her with piercing red eyes. She glared up at him, her hand over her heart. "Don't do that, it's so creepy, you watching me from so close." Kurama gave an eye roll. "What do you remember?" Furrowing her brows, Naruto tried to recall the previous event. The 4 Edo Tensei Hokage had arrived, and she was engaged in combat with Obito and Madara. Madara had. With a screech, she leapt to her feet. What did that bastard do? What did he mean by following history? And why the hell are you so calm? Naruto looked to Kurama for clarification, wondering why the fox was lying so peacefully with his head resting on his crossed hands. Pause. He has 5 fingers and his upper body is human. Like, Kurama let out a long, full-bodied sigh, wondering why this keeps happening to her. She received many of those. Naruto nodded, unsure of his next move. You remember how you noticed all the weird looks from Madara and the Shodem and Nidiami? Like they knew you? He asked. It's because they do know you. Or did, rather. Naruto gave Kurama a blank stare. With a slow voice, she explained, they died decades before I was born, as though addressing a young child. He's gone crazy. She believed that his mind had been ruined by all those years of confinement and that he had gone completely insane. Kurama took a deep breath and looked up, as she had seen Iruka-sensei do many times when she was being particularly challenging. Naruto frowned as she extended an arm to touch the spot where she recalled feeling Madara's chakra condense on her. Madara placed you in a seal that acted like the other Uchiha's Kamui. It used your chakra to send you back in time. Madara placed something on your back, remember? She asked. It's a seal that acts as a timer, basically. When you've spent however long here the seal is timed for, it will pull you back. Before her eyes widened abruptly, Naruto remained silent, allowing this to sink in. I can't stay here. We were barely holding on, the Jubi was transforming, they need me, we have to go back. Unless you've suddenly become a seal master overnight and can override Madara's seal on you, we can't. Not until the seal times out. Kurama clarified. Any space. Time travel is difficult to control, so I'm not sure how much time will pass there while we're here. Months could go by in just a minute. How do you know all this anyway? Naruto glared up at him angrily. Kurama yelled, you gave me control when blacking out, baka. I forced you to give me control because your mind couldn't have taken time travel. After learning what I could from it, I concealed the seal under a genjutsu and hardly felt the effects. Additionally, I took care to conceal anything you owned that contained identifying symbols. The majority of your clothing bearing the Uzumaki symbol, along with your headband, are concealed in the forest. What made you do that? Saddened by the loss of her headband, Naruto squatted. Madara sent us back in time to the Warring States era. Naruto's eyes widened. She knew the basics of history but didn't pay much attention in school. That far? How could that have happened? One of the strongest shinobi alive, Madara had decades after his alleged death to learn new tricks, Kurama snarled. It's impossible to predict what else he might do. Recalling the experience of 2 meteors being hauled out of space onto the Gaara's company, Naruto swallowed. All right, but what's that got to do with my headband and clothes? The Uzumaki clan does not know anything about you, and they are active during this time. Being regarded as clanless is preferable to attempting to establish a clan affiliation. Your headband I hid because they would have asked about any kind of symbol you might have had on you, Kurama suggested, adding that it would be safer for the first time to use your father's name, Namikaze, rather than Uzumaki. Naruko nodded, absorbing what she had learned, but then he said something that caught her attention. They? Who are they? Even the Sharingan couldn't see the seal without using my chakra because it couldn't be hidden. Kurama paused here, taking a slow breath, a growl mingled deep in his chest. Fortunately, it was not Madara or any of his ilk. Powerful sensors sensed me and came running, but I finished and retreated back here before they came, though not before I saw who they were. Hashirama and Tobirama, the Senju, are the ones who have you. So, wherever they took me, I'm unconscious? She inquired. I made sure to bring you here when your mind started waking, the fox said, nodding. To keep them from killing you, you must come up with a compelling tale to tell them. That made Naruko jump. Kill me? Would they actually do that? Kurama's crimson eyes met her own. This is a period of distrust and strife. Nobody revealed their family name out of concern that the new acquaintance would be a clan enemy and would murder them. Naruko realized, that's why you want me to use Namikaze, and then absently scratched her cheek, wondering how she was going to come up with, let alone remember, a compelling story. It will be easier to remember if it has some truth in it, Kurama remarked after seemingly realizing who he was speaking to. The best lies are ones that have the truth. That makes sense, Naruko said, nodding. How can I describe your chakra so that I can still be an orphan? While waiting, Kurama came up with a few quick answers, saying, you can say that I attacked your village the day you were born. Up until Madara finds me, I'm acting irrationally. Your parents were killed, but some of my chakra was absorbed by your body. Remembering that is not too difficult. Naruko dropped to her knees and sat back on her heels, saying, I think I'm getting the hang of this. I had no relatives to take me in, and people ignored me because of the marks on my face and the chakra I absorbed. A wandering shinobi was passing through my village and sensed the chakra in me, she said, pausing to try to swallow the lump in her throat before continuing, because I reminded them of the attack too much. He trained you as a shinobi to control the chakra and you left the village with him. Kurama came to a conclusion. The Senju might have sensed the Uzumaki chakra in you, so you can say he was taking you to the clan to see for sure when he was killed protecting you. The maid. Up backstory was fairly easy to recall, so Naruko nodded and said, he told me to find the Senju clan or Uzumaki clan before he died and I was searching for them when I was attacked. As long as you can keep them from prying, it should hold, Kurama said, recalling the story with some gaps but enough familiarity to her past for her to recall it easily. We made it possible for you to use my chakra, but excessive use will make people notice you. What attacks can I not do? She asked, scowling and crossing her arms. The fox replied, try to avoid sage mode. You can't claim Jiraiya taught you how to use it because not many shinobi outside of Hashirama are proficient in it at this time. He realized, you can't use your clones. With her arms raised to her sides and her fists clenched, Naruko exclaimed, why not? The shadow clone was created by Tobirama. With a sneer, he added, unless you tell them the truth a Euro. Which you better know to Euro, and make them think that you, Tobirama, and the people he's shown are the only ones who know the technique. If you appeared out of nowhere with the ability to use it, it would raise suspicions. You can only use your clones if you were fortunate enough to learn how to do it from Tobirama. Naruko gritted her teeth and growled, this is awful. That implies that I can hardly use any of my jutsu, let alone any of my Rasengan. Can you recall the story now? You'll have to deal with it, Kurama said firmly. You won't make a mistake once you wake up after leaving this place. She gritted her teeth and said, frustrated but powerless, I can remember it. Just give me a minute to wrap my head around everything. When Kurama had his full attention, he continued, Naruko. He could see the feelings growing in his host's heart and knew that she needed a way to concentrate for however long she was here, something to take away her anger at her situation. Damn brat has made me soft. You're you, he added wryly, and making friends with the Hokage brats should be easy if you could connect with all the tailed beasts, including me. In addition to the fundamentals the hermit taught you, train with them and have Hashirama teach you seals. In order to be better equipped to face the Madara in our time, do that and strengthen yourself here. After a few moments of silently staring at him, her tense, emotional muscles gradually relaxed, and she gave the fox a tiny, genuine smile before saying, thank you, Kurama. The fox turned his face away from her and plopped his head back on his arms, saying, just get out of here and wake up already. She gave him a cheeky salute before closing her eyes and concentrating on waking up, her smile changing to her signature foxy grin. The girl woke up a day and a half after he and Hashirama had discovered her. Tobirama had spent most of that time contemplating her and her potential origins. An Uzumaki without red hair was possible, but there weren't many, that particular gene being particularly strong. The only reason he and his brother thought she was one was because the Uzumaki had a unique tinge to their chakra that only strong sensors could detect. Their bloodline of longevity, resilience, and special chakra was undeniable. There was practically no way that the girl could have escaped discovery. The Uzumaki in her was too strong to be diluted from generations. One of her parents was a powerful full-blooded Uzumaki. The Uzumaki clan was close-knit and very family-oriented. If someone in the clan had a child, it would be known and the child would be taken in, given to a family if the birth parents were dead. They would find out the truth when she woke up and be questioned. If her story made sense, they would take her to the Uzumaki clan. If not, he and Hashirama would decide how to handle her. While Tobirama had shadow clones watching the perimeter, absorbed in his thoughts, she remained unconscious for the most part. The chakra-suppressing seal wouldn't come off her until it was established that she was not a threat, but the fact that she woke up an hour before sunset on the second day after they found her helped confirm that the Uzumaki blood in her was strong. They always recovered very quickly from serious injuries and chakra exhaustion. His chakra fluctuated from slow and steady to gradually spiking, and when he looked over at her, he saw her beginning to move. He had been sitting next to the futon against the wall, staring at the small fire he had started, with one leg bent with his elbow resting on it and the other stretched out. Only because of his reflexes and extraordinary speed was he able to chase her down immediately, tackling her around the waist as she stepped outside. Tobirama had been expecting a gradual awakening, consciousness returning slowly because of her low chakra, and he had not been expecting her eyes to open and reveal breathtakingly bright blue eyes before she shot up and headed for the door. They hit the ground hard, him on top of her, and she began to struggle right away, moving on sheer willpower, and he was shocked by her strength and energy given how tired she should be and that she didn't have access to her chakra. He remained on his knees, securing the girl in his arms with one arm around her waist and the other in a loose hold around her neck. She managed to get her legs in front of her, but he kept her body too low for her to push herself up with them. She was trying to get the leverage to get her feet or knees under her, and she alternated between clawing his arms, elbowing his stomach, or trying to scratch his face. The girl was able to free one leg enough to execute a curving back kick, driving her heel into his back and knocking him to the side. "Will you stop? I will not injure you." She was so flexible that she nearly kicked the top of his head, which was nearly a full vertical kick, and he forced out when he barely avoided getting his face kicked. He hoped she would exhaust herself or the awkward positioning of her limbs would get to her. He was trying not to hurt her. He was glad he had taken off his armor hours ago, or else she might have seriously hurt herself on it, not to mention this would be even more awkward. When she tried to do it again, he quickly caught her leg under the knee with the arm around her waist, and he had to strain against her to pull his arm back and pin her leg to her stomach. Her movements slowed and her leg trembled, as if her adrenaline had finally worn off. He held her tightly until she became completely motionless except for her heaving chest, and although her head was drooping forward, preventing him from seeing her face, she appeared to calm down. He wouldn't let go of her, but he did loosen his hold slightly. "Are you ready to listen now?" Her eyes were rich blue, with shades ranging from bright electric to dark sapphire, with a violet ring around her pupils. The girl tensed at the sound of his voice, and he allowed her to turn her head enough to look at him. Her eyes widened when she saw his face, and he could see the surprise clearly on her face and in her eyes. Hashirama was standing at the tree line with a big smile on his face, and he was actually startled when he heard someone clearing their throat. He and the girl tensed, heads whipping around to the source of the noise, suggesting that they had been staring at each other for longer than he had thought. "Am I interrupting something?" As they stood up, Tobirama kept one hand on the girl's elbow, observing that the top of her head came just below his chin, and he noticed the almost odd looks the girl gave him and his brother, which she attempted to conceal. His ears were burning, and he saw the girl's neck flush dark red. Tobirama realized what the way he was holding her looked like, and he slowly let her go, embarrassed but cautious. After walking to the cabin's door and pausing a few feet away, Hashirama saw that his brother was not wearing the cloth on his forehead and had a light genjutsu over the senju marks on his armor. "What's your name?" The girl, who was 20.1 years old and only 3 or 4 years younger than him, looked back and forth between them as the hand of the arm he wasn't holding played with the end of her now even more untidy hair. "My name is Naruto." Her voice was soft and feminine, but a little husky for a girl. "I'm Hashirama, and that's my brother Tobirama," Hashirama said with a soft smile in an attempt to calm her. We only have a few questions, we don't mean any harm. Let's go inside. When she had finished searching, she looked back at him and his brother and nodded. Tobirama let go of her elbow but stayed close behind her as he followed her back to the cabin, Hashirama moving aside so Naruto was the first one in. Naruto looked around them, taking in the surroundings, and he figured she was trying to decide whether or not she could make a run for it or trying to find any landmarks she might recognize. After the door had been shut and Naruto had almost fallen on the futon, he and Hashirama had dragged the other 2 chairs to the front of her and sat down, not too close as to frighten her, but not too far away either. Her body must be extremely tired and sore from the little skirmish earlier, and Naruto ignored them for a while, settling her body gingerly back against the wall. Her gaze shifted to the table where her weapons and scrolls were, and then she yanked up her arm's sleeve, glaring at the suppression seal that stood out in stark contrast to her tanned skin. That glare then moved up to them as she yanked her sleeve back down with a harsh yank. It simply stops you from accessing your chakra, Hashirama explained. It won't prevent you from getting it back. That seal remains in place until we determine whether you pose a threat, even though your levels were dangerously low when we discovered you. Will you respond to our inquiries? After hearing the seal's explanation, Naruto appeared to relax a little. I'll respond as best I can, but first, may I have some water? In an attempt to maintain Naruto's composure, Hashirama grinned and said, of course. Tobirama, would you? He obeyed without a word, allowing his brother to lead the way in order to get through the interrogation as amicably as possible. Although he was regarded as an adult, she was still very young, not to mention a woman by herself, and Hashirama's distaste for violence against children was starting to show. He would do everything in his power to obtain the information they required without causing her any harm. Tobirama knelt down and gave Naruto the glass of water, both of them staring again as their fingers touched. He was awake enough to acknowledge that she was extremely attractive, which made her being by herself all the more concerning. He got back up and went to his seat, conscious of his brother standing behind him. Hashirama leaned forward and placed his elbows on his knees after allowing her to drink for a while. Now, Naruto, what is your last name? We can't let you go without knowing, but we won't hurt you when we find out unless we are provoked to do so. Tobirama paid close attention to her body language and chakra, keeping an eye out for any indications of dishonesty. Her hands clenched on the glass, but she responded without further encouragement, Namikaze. He had never heard of a Namikaze, so she was probably from a civilian family or an orphanage, and since she wasn't lying, she probably didn't know her heritage unless she was looking for them. Why are you in this place? Hashirama inquired. I'm looking for some people, she replied hazily, and Hashirama just stared at her without saying anything, telling her to elaborate. I think they may be able to help me, she said. Are you an orphan? Hashirama asked, already figuring out the response. Yes, Naruto said plainly, taking another sip of water, from the day I was born. He exchanged a glance with his brother, saying, if her parents were killed so young, that would explain why she didn't know she was an Uzumaki, but that doesn't explain her training. How are you trained? Tobirama inquired. This time, she placed the glass on the ground and said, it's kind of a long, confusing story. We have time. Hashirama leaned back in his chair. Naruto looked into both of their eyes and sighed, saying, to begin with, Kyuubi attacked my village the day I was born. Ignoring their shocked looks, she continued, well, less attacked and more in the way of wherever he was going. What is your age? Entire villages were frequently erased from the map when in the path of a Biju, and the Kyuubi in particular appeared to be hostile and hateful, so most people simply tried to avoid them. Tobirama asked. That depends. How long was I out? Scowled Naruto. Nearly 2 days have passed. October 11th, Hashirama declared. Huh, she said simply, her brows slightly furrowed. So I'm 17. My birthday is the 10th. Tobirama saw that she appeared too perplexed, and while he was correct in his estimation of her age, the day of your birth wasn't particularly confusing. Please continue telling your story, Hashirama said gently. Oh, right. Naruto sighed and rubbed the back of her neck. My parents were among those who perished that day while attempting to avoid him until he passed. Touching the marks on her face, she explained, I don't know how it was possible, but I somehow absorbed some of his chakra, and that's where these come from what people told me. Hashirama gestured for her to stop without saying anything. Tobirama nodded at his brother's expression, and they both used their senses to focus on her chakra even more, moving past her strong, warm chakra until they found a source of very strong, dark chakra euro. A lot of it. This supported her story, but it was unprecedented for a newborn baby to simply absorb a Biju's chakra. Hashirama, who needed to hear more of her story, encouraged her to go on by waving her on. The villagers took me with them when my parents died, and when the Kyuubi left, they went back to rebuild. She appeared a little irritated by the interruption, but she was also keeping a close eye on them, probably looking for any indication that they might attack her in light of what she had just disclosed. She explained calmly, which was surprising given what she was saying. I was told that it didn't take long for people to realize that I had absorbed the chakra and they feared me, and that fear turned to hate, she said. An elderly couple was the only ones who would look after me when I was a baby, but I don't remember them because they passed away when I was 4. I lived alone in their tiny house after that since no one would take me in. I suppose the marks and the chakra made them think too much of the people they had lost. The only reason I knew my name was because an old man and his daughter, who ran a restaurant, knew my parents and were nice to me. Everyone always called me Demon, or Brat, or that kid and ignored me, keeping their kids away too. Although he appeared to be attempting to concentrate on her story, Tobirama could see Hashirama's tendency to become depressed beginning to set in. This time, Tobirama didn't bother to yell at his brother. Her story was upsetting because it demonstrated how cruel and ignorant people can be to a helpless child. Despite the fact that such treatment from such a young age would leave emotional scars, Naruko was telling the story in the tone of someone accustomed to such treatment, as if it no longer affected her. With a sorrowful smile, Naruko drew her knees to her chest and encircled them with her arms. When I was 10, some old wandering ninja was passing through. He told me he felt the powerful chakra within me, told me why everyone hated me. He said that I had dangerously high chakra levels and to leave me untrained would run the risk of me losing control or someone finding me and using me. I left the village with him and he trained me as we wandered. He took care of me. Tobirama knew this man had passed away, not too long ago, based on the way her eyes grew dimmer and the softer tone of her voice. He lowered his voice and inquired, what was his name? She uttered, Jiraiya. Just Jiraiya. He taught me how to use chakra, how to fight and defend myself. He said he knew some clans that could help me with the fox's chakra, but he died a few months ago protecting me. He told me to find the Uzumaki, Uchiha, or Senju clan and that they would help me. I was trying to find them when I was attacked and used up my chakra. It's only when my levels are low that the Kyuubi's chakra comes out and I never remember what happens. When she finished, Tobirama turned to face his brother. Her story made sense given what they knew, but it was unclear how someone with demonic chakra could roam aimlessly for years. Additionally, this Jiraiya should look for the 3 clans she mentioned. Hashirama, with his wood style and sage chakra, could also tame the chakra, and the Uzumaki were sealing masters who could undoubtedly seal it. If she had lost control, the Uchiha could have controlled her with their Sharingan. Tobirama was extremely relieved that they had come across her because whoever had discovered her first would have had a significant advantage in the ongoing conflicts. Even if she didn't want to, most people wouldn't think twice about using her as a living weapon. And now it was more natural for her to be an Uzumaki. She could very well have that chakra inside of her given their ancestry, fortitude, and strength. That clan was the only one capable of securely holding a tailed beast's chakra. Hashirama got up and returned his chair to the table, saying, I'm going to talk to my brother outside, please don't try to leave. Tobirama did the same. His brother added, I'm going to take your weapons as a precaution, grabbing the scrolls and weapons as he went by. Naruko turned her head to look at the dying fire and uncurled, extending her legs to lean back against the wall. My chakra's sealed and I'm outclassed by you both. I'm not dumb enough to try and leave with you here and no way to defend myself. After giving her a nod, Hashirama and she left the cabin, making sure the door was shut behind them. Naruko had not realized how long they had been questioning him. When they went outside at twilight, the only sounds they heard were crickets and the waking of nocturnal creatures. Hashirama's aura darkened as soon as he was out of her line of sight, but he maintained his composure because he knew that this was not the time for his typical antics. She was telling the truth or she's a complete sociopath and an amazing actor, Hashirama murmured. Her chakra kept steady and her body language was normal for some of the things she revealed and for someone in her situation. He folded his arms across his chest and said, her story makes sense, though with her teacher dead and a village that is probably glad she's gone, there is no one to corroborate it. Even if we did manage to find the one village that was in the Kyuubi's path 17 years ago and it be the one in her story, they all have probably forgotten she was there or will pretend like it. Tobirama concluded. Her permanent departure would have been welcomed by the villagers. Hashirama asked him, do you think we should tell the Uzumaki? Tobirama considered all the information and potential dangers. Tobirama remarked, at the very least have them send Mito or her father to see what they can do about the chakra. If they want to take her in, they can ask her. We can tell her who we are since she is safest with us for now, considering Madara and the danger the man might be now that his brother is gone. With you, if she loses control she can be stopped, so it would be best for her to remain with us. Hidden. Until they can get here. Hashirama crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall, nodding. Your absence will be noticed if you remain away for much longer, and we need to keep knowledge of her as quiet as possible. At most, you can stay another 2 days, after that I'll leave a wood clone with her. If I send a message in the morning to the Uzumaki, it would take at least a week for them to arrive with a small party. She needs to be put on a probationary period if we take her to the clan. Even if she has no loyalties to a clan, it doesn't mean she's not a threat. How long do you think we should keep her chakra sealed? Tobirama inquired. Glancing back at the cabin door, Hashirama scowled. She might grow to resent us for the loss of control. With her past, the ability to defend herself and control over her own body must be driving forces, so not too long. Hashirama thought. She said it herself, the only reason she's being so cooperative is because she knows we can overpower her easily and she has no way of defending herself. Tobirama came up with an idea that might work out wonderfully for them, or it might cost them her. Can you alter the seal so she has access to some of her chakra? Not all of it by any means, but enough to use basic jutsu? Hashirama caught on and grinned, showing her a sign of goodwill and giving her a reason to believe we don't mean her any harm. She could possibly stay of her own will and be more relaxed and open around us if she doesn't feel completely defenseless. Hashirama jumped off the wall. I'll do it now, but then I'll have to be heading back. Try not to get into a situation like what I saw when I first arrived. We're trying to be friendly, but not that friendly, Hashirama said. Refusing to rise to his brother's baiting, Tobirama grunted. He was already aware that her targeted struggle would likely result in some bruises. Naruko was still standing there, staring into the fire, when he followed his brother back inside. Her eyes, which he had never seen before, caught his attention once more. The violet flecks he had seen earlier turned red in her eyes as he saw the reflection of the blazing embers. When they re-entered, those eyes turned on them. She pushed herself off the wall and crossed her legs before asking, "So what's the verdict?" Tobirama followed Hashirama as he sat on his knees in front of her. When she noticed that they were now sitting on her level rather than above her as before, her eyes widened. Hashirama gave her a smile. "First off, I'll tell you our whole names. I'm Senju Hashirama, but I have a feeling you already knew that, didn't you?" Tobirama realized that he and his brother had been correct when he saw Naruko's eyes enlarge. When Hashirama had first arrived, she had appeared to recognize them immediately, and when she had mentioned the Senju clan, she couldn't help but glance in their direction. Naruko ducked her head as she flushed. "I didn't know if I should say it or not. Jiraiya told me what he knew the leaders of the clans looked like. Silver hair and red markings are kind of a giveaway," she said with a nod. "Even if you don't come from a clan, passing shinobi aren't quiet when talking about their enemies." Hashirama gave a nod. When Naruko realized she wouldn't be held responsible for keeping information from him, she relaxed and nodded. "True enough. These are dangerous times and we don't fault you for not saying anything. I am going to contact the Uzumaki clan. They are close allies of ours, and we will both see what we can do for you. Unfortunately, we cannot trust you enough to take you to our clan. You will have to remain here until they arrive. Tobirama will stay for a few more days and then I will have a clone with you." Her words were, "I understand," looking sideways, she said, "I won't cause any problems. Can I go outside, though?" Although he showed no indication of his inner thoughts, Tobirama couldn't help but find the expression on her face adorable. He wanted to like her because there was something charming about her. "When you're stronger, you can go with me, but we will stay close. You cannot leave without me or my brother's clone. That's non-negotiable." Already excited at the prospect of venturing outdoors, Naruko nodded. With one hand extended toward his ink supply, Hashirama extended the other. Even more perplexed by what he had grabbed, Naruko scooted forward until her arm was in Hashirama's grasp after pulling her sleeve up to reveal the seal. His brother explained, "I'm not completely unsealing your chakra," and he began working. "Most of it will still be sealed off until we trust you, but I'm giving you access to enough to defend yourself with on the off chance this place is discovered." As he explained, Naruko nodded and looked interestedly at the brush drawing tiny, exact lines on her arm. The effect was instantaneous after Hashirama finished and completed the seal with a chakra flare. Even with limited access, Naruko's chakra had already fully recovered, and her chakra surged to the forefront, filling the tiny cabin they were in with warmth. He pondered whether she possessed extraordinary reserves naturally or if the fox's chakra was the cause of it all. As Naruko felt her chakra once more, her entire body relaxed and a tiny smile came to her face. As she turned to face Hashirama, that little smile grew into a dazzling smile. It was obviously the right decision to grant her chakra access once more. Thank you. Tobirama's own lips curled into a tiny smile, and he saw his brother return the favor by grinning back. In contrast to what they were accustomed to and taught from an early age, her personality and emotions were so open, and her mood was contagious. Hashirama stood up and rocked back on his heels by shifting his weight. With a wave, he said, "Well, I must be heading back. Tobirama will stay with you and I'll send word when the Uzumaki are near." "Ya nay," going out of the cabin. Tobirama realized that he would be spending a few days alone in a cabin with a girl he found attractive as the cabin door closed behind his brother. When it came to his feelings and how he responded to them, Tobirama was realistic and not one to try to fool himself. He is aware of and has admitted to having a strong physical attraction to Naruto. He also knows that the mystery and puzzle she offers him further piques his interest. Additionally, he is aware that his treatment of her has been less harsh and more thoughtful. She probably would have been killed or subjected to more severe interrogation if she hadn't had the unique chakra field that identified her as Uzumaki. She must at least somewhat understand that. The silence that fell between them after Hashirama left was heavy enough to be classified as awkward. He watched her openly while Naruto played with the end of her hair and gazed intently in any direction other than his. She was quite attractive. It was a more natural beauty, not the traditional, high-born beauty he typically saw among the more prestigious clans. Her personality was what gave her more character and made her stand out, even though the whisker lines on her face highlighted her cheekbones and gave her an exotic appearance. She was so expressive with every part of her, and her features were full of warmth and vitality when she was awake. He nodded to encourage her to speak after she nervously cleared her throat. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, embarrassed by what she had done, and said, Sorry about earlier. I freak out when I wake up somewhere I don't know." He nodded without resentment. He needed to make her more at ease with them as soon as possible. It's understandable. Anyone would react badly to waking up somewhere strange. Naruto appeared to calm down a little, but he saw that her gaze was fixed on the bathroom door. "Here," he said, tossing her the storage scroll containing her clothes. "You can clean up if you want. I'll fix something to eat." Naruto said a little, "Thank you," to him before heading to the restroom. Although there was only a sink to truly wash up with, the cabin had running water because it was connected to an underground water source that the rest of the clan use. After rekindling the fire, Tobirama started preparing some new stew, which wouldn't take long because he had already prepared some earlier. Having finished questioning her, he was at a loss for words and actions. He was aware that he could delve deeper into her past and elicit additional information from her beyond the hazy details she had provided. He was aware that part of his task for the next few days was to get to know her better and try to uncover any inconsistencies in her story or lies she might have told. After a few minutes, Naruto emerged, and when he turned around, he saw that she had changed out of her full-length pants and into some black capris and a new black shirt without sleeves. She held her shoes in her hand and draped her dark orange jacket over one arm, along with the bandages that had been wrapped around her legs. She emerged with her hair hanging damply around her face after getting it wet under the sink. Her hair, which was a combination of curls and spikes and fell in a golden cascade around her body, was less tangled and wild as it reached her mid-back. When she saw his eyes, Naruto smiled at him, and he nodded in return before turning back to finish the meal. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her put her clothes down by the futon. She took out the sealing scroll and sealed the bandage wraps and her other clothing. He noticed the edge of another seal on the back of her right shoulder as her shirt moved while she was sitting up and dragging her hair over her shoulder to run her fingers through it. Most of it was still hidden by the shirt, but he squinted at it. He couldn't read the symbols clearly because they were angled incorrectly. But it was a mark against her that she had not brought up this seal. And it wasn't a tattoo, it was a seal. Only a small percentage of shinobi had tattoos, and those that did usually placed them in easily covered areas. He has observed that the most popular application is a summoning tattoo, which speeds up the summoning jutsu technique. His own markings are the outcome of his developing new skills and growing understanding of various chakra types. They were a defining characteristic, and even though the majority of shinobi knew one another from past conflicts and reputation, it was still too risky for someone in Naruto's position. She couldn't be given secrets in her case, and based on Mito's words, she might still have to be killed. He forgot about the seal and took another look at her attire. Another thing he was trying to adjust to was her attire. Because they were confined to their family homes, the majority of women wore kimonos. Although the few women who received shinobi training occasionally wore pants, the majority wore kimonos made especially for their freedom of movement because pants would attract unwelcome attention for the kind of missions they performed. He returned his attention to the food, preparing it and arranging the table. Naruto let her hair hang down her back after finishing it. Naruto. He nodded at the table to get her attention, and she got up to join him. They ate in silence, which was neither particularly comfortable nor as awkward as before. They ate rapidly without talking. She assisted him in cleaning up after they had finished eating, and they both returned to their seats at the table. No scrolls or anything potentially hazardous were ever left here, and there wasn't much to do for recreation. He chose to be direct because that was really all they had left to do. "What's the seal on your back?" With wide eyes, Naruko's head jerked up to gaze at him, and her brow furrowed. He knew almost instantly that what she was going to say would be false when she jerked her shoulder forward and jerked her head around to see the edge of the seal. But he remained silent because of the fear and anger on her face. Oh, that one. Jiraiya was good with seals. He put it on me to help repress the chakra. It was only supposed to be temporary until he got me to safety." With a single glance at Naruto, Tobirama knew he didn't buy it, but he remained silent, happy to wait for the Uzumaki to arrive so they could examine it. He was still learning and was a little above average when it came to seals, but he trusted the clan of famous seal masters to know better than he would. She was terrible at hiding her telltale signs, so he knew she had said most of the truth earlier, and at least he knew what she looked like when she was lying. Compared to everyone else he was accustomed to interacting with, she was so much more approachable. Although they respected him, his clan members weren't very forthright about their feelings. He knew that many women were compelled to approach him in order to raise their social status and find a strong husband to protect them, even though the women in his clan and the few he met outside of it weren't particularly cold. The majority of the people he spoke with had an undercurrent of manipulation. It was both refreshing and confusing to see Naruko wearing her heart on her sleeve. Tobirama decided that now was a good time to try to figure out who she was. "Do you hate them? The people from the village you were born in?" With her fingers frozen where she had been tapping them on her arm, Naruko blinked and stared at him blankly. "What?" He crossed his legs and leaned back in his chair. "I'm trying to get to know you. We're going to be stuck here for a few days and there's not much else to do." With the exception of crossing her arms over her chest, Naruko adopted his posture. She was becoming more defensive and closing off in her body language. He shrugged and she sighed, but he noticed a tiny twitch of her lips. "And you decided to start with that instead of anything else? Not my favorite color, favorite food?" he asked. "How about a deal? We take turns asking questions. If you can't tell me things because of the situation I understand, but you answer what you can." Tobirama recognized that there were some things he couldn't say, so she didn't see any harm in it. "Okay, but first you answer mine." She rolled her eyes and questioned, "You're persistent, aren't you?" "No, I don't hate them. Not anymore. When I was little, when no one would tell me why I would get kicked out of shops or parents told their kids to stay away, I did. I wanted to get revenge on them for treating me that way, for letting me be alone." With genuine curiosity, he inquired quietly, "What changed?" Her eyes were far away as she grinned. She paused, her eyes glazing over for a few seconds before focusing back on him and smiling sadly. "I met people who saw me for me, not as a reminder of what they lost. They showed me what it was like to have people to care for me, and once Jiraiya explained everything to me, I understood them. I wish them no harm. I'd protect that village with my life because it's where my few precious people are and they have people they care about there. I wouldn't wish the pain of losing their precious people on them." Tobirama remained quiet, taking in her words. He found it difficult to envision such a life without becoming cynical and despising the world. Had he been in her shoes, he most likely would have detested the village and abandoned those he didn't care about to decay, rather than defending everyone for the benefit of a select few. He gave her a nod. "Your turn. It's late, so we should probably stick to only a few more." She uncrossed her arms and leaned forward. As she placed her chin in her palm, her smile shifted to one that was more playful. "What's your favorite color?" As he responded, he tilted his head in her direction, unable to contain a smile of his own. He shot back at her, "Blue. Dark blue. Favorite food?" With a quick response, she continued to smile. She paused, trying to think of a question to pose. "Ramen. The old man and his daughter who looked out for me had a ramen restaurant. Any family other than Hashirama?" Tobirama's smile gradually faded. Even though his younger brothers had passed away a long time ago, he still disliked thinking about them. Naruko's own smile faded as if she could sense his mood shift. "We had two younger brothers, Kawurama and Itama. They died very young because of all the fighting. Our father's been dead a few years, and our mother died when we were young, so there's only me and Hashirama." He could see understanding in Naruko's eyes, and she remained silent. "Shinobi often die young, but something I realized is that they are never gone unless you forget them. The memory of them and what they are fighting for is always with the people that love them. Naruko placed her hand on her heart. They live on in here. As long as their memory and ideals are still alive, so are they because they live on through us. Forgetting someone is the only way they can ever be gone, because then there's not even a memory of their existence. No matter how painful the memories, I'd never let myself forget the people I've lost. They locked eyes. For once, she broke eye contact and pushed herself up to return to the futon, but he had no idea what his face might have been saying. She laughed nervously and rubbed the back of her head, avoiding eye contact with him. "Sorry if I overstepped," she said. "I usually talk before I think." He snapped out of it and got up to follow her, grabbing her by the elbow. She looked up at him, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and said, "No, it's fine, really." He chose to match her candor by saying, "Thank you for saying that, Naruko. Most people in this time, with all the fighting going on around us, say that children who die are just doing their duty to their clan. That's stupid." She practically exploded, turning to face him and shocking him once more with her intense feelings. She yanked her arm out of his loose hold and began to pace while muttering angrily to herself, "Kids are just that. Kids, they should be out playing games and pulling pranks, not fighting for their lives and then told they're doing their duty to their clan." Tobirama was left gaping at her in disbelief once more. He was reminded of Hashirama by her. Even with the clan that had murdered their younger brothers and numerous other family members, his brother still longed for peace. He shared his brother's frustration with the fighting, but he lacked his brother's optimism for peace. She was stopped once more when he grabbed her by the shoulders. Her face was flushed with emotion, and her eyes were flashing. The feelings she was experiencing on behalf of him and his family, total strangers who were essentially keeping her against her will, captivated him as he gazed into her eyes. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and he didn't think he would. "You are something else, Naruko." As she calmed, he lost time and gazed into her eyes. She just stared back into his eyes without moving. They didn't separate until the final log in the now. Small fire burst, making them both jump. They both avoided eye contact and cleared their throats. A wave of frustration swept through Tobirama. For heaven's sake, he had never acted and felt so irrationally, especially towards someone he had just met. While Naruko tinkled with her sealing scrolls back at the futon, he hurried to tend to the fire. He only added 2 more logs to the fire because he knew it was almost midnight. Until they went to sleep, it was sufficient to keep it running and keep the cabin warm. He turned to her, but he was determined to ignore how much he liked it. Tobirama," he asked himself, noting that it was the first time she had said his name. Fidgeting with a blanket she must have taken from her storage scroll. Naruko was kneeling by the futon. She continued to keep her eyes away from him. "Where do you sleep? There's only one futon here." He pointedly avoided the idea of sharing the little futon with her, saying, "I can sleep well enough on the floor. While you may be better, your strength hasn't fully returned, so you can have it." Even without those thoughts interfering with his thoughts, this day was strange enough. She said, "Fine, but after tonight we can alternate." She made it clear that she would not be complaining about the fact. They both finished settling down in quiet after he nodded his agreement. Even though they were still hardly acquainted, they appeared to be less of strangers. Yes, Tobirama was aware of Naruko's past, but that was only about her and not who she was, and the more she talked, the more he felt compelled to learn more about her. She was so unique, so vibrant, so genuine, and so bright. Other than the occasional release of tension, he had never expressed interest in women. All of that was physical. Despite being one of the most attractive women he had ever seen, Naruko captivated him emotionally. His curiosity about why she was so different from everyone he knew grew as he learned more. He leaned back against the wall next to her head, facing the fire, while Naruko pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. "Tobirama?" In response, he hummed, tucking his chin to his chest, crossing his arms, and leaning as comfortably against the wall as he could. As she lay on her side facing him, he caught a glimpse of her smiling. "I understand that you can't get much sleep because you have to watch me, but please trust that I have no intention of running away or killing you in your sleep." She threw something at him and slightly sat up. "Here." Feeling the little pillow give under his hands, he grabbed it with ease. He rolled his eyes a little, but he accepted it because he could already tell she was obstinate. They fell silent once more after he placed the pillow behind his shoulders to protect them from the wall. After half an hour, he realized Naruko was still awake. They were both silently staring at the fire, attempting to fall asleep. Tobirama didn't know what was keeping Naruko awake, but he had already made plans to remain on watch for the majority of the night. In fact, it was difficult to resist falling asleep to the sensation of her chakra enveloping the tiny cabin. It was soothing in a manner reminiscent of Hashirama's. "Hey, Tobirama." He looked at Naruko, who had curled up and was a little startled by the whisper. She was on the verge of falling asleep because her voice and eyes were worn out. Not wanting to disturb the calm and cozy ambiance surrounding them, he hummed back. One more question. Do you have a dream? Mine's peace. I hate fighting a want to protect my friends. He was stunned into silence for so long that Naruto fell asleep before he could respond, eventually giving in to her fatigue. He had something to think about for the rest of the evening because of her question. He was aware of his brother's dream of peace and clan unification in order to create a secure environment where kids could truly have the opportunity to grow up. He himself? I have no idea. He certainly had aspirations. He put a lot of effort into developing his own jutsu, strengthening the ones he already had, and growing stronger. He had a dream, but he also wanted to protect his brother and clan. To be honest, he couldn't think of one. He honestly couldn't think of anything he particularly wanted for the future, but Naruto was like his brother in that she aspired to peace and wanted to protect the people she cared about. He had neither their faith nor their hope for clan peace and harmony. Too much bloodshed, violence, and history existed between them all, particularly between the Senju and Uchiha. Hashirama thought that understanding one another would lead to peace, but only if everyone committed to a set of guidelines could this be accomplished. Oh, he would be all for it if his brother could somehow manage his dream, giving his life to defend the village his brother had imagined. Like Hashirama, he was sick of the fighting and death, but he had a more realistic or, if you ask his brother, pessimistic perspective. In his contemplation, Tobirama came to a realization. He didn't have a dream of his own, even if his brothers did. Protecting his brother's dream was the only thing that came to mind, but he suspected that if Naruto remembered her question in the morning, she wouldn't take that as an answer. Naruto awoke in her mindscape once more. This is becoming a regular thing with you, Kurama. Kurama was looming over her head, his eyes as close to her face as he could get, and she was lying flat on her back, which was really confusing because her mindscape had changed from a sewer to this formless place. She assumed he wasn't angry because he didn't appear particularly irate, but he also didn't appear particularly pleased. It was too much for her to care about. Even though Kurama was a grump, she could needle them until they broke, just like when she dealt with a hungover arrow. Senin or Ba-chan. At this rate, they'll know the truth within a week, brat, he said. You get too personal and involved in things, but I know better than to try and get you to stop. She grinned. Ah, you know me so well, Kura-kun. The fox snorted and drew his head back, blowing her hair in her face as his bright red eyes nearly crossed. What did you just call me? No, don't repeat it, don't ever call me that again, you little brat. As Naruto sat up and turned to face him, her smile remained contentedly on her face. So other than telling me how bad of a liar I am, why'd you pull me here? They seemed to buy the cover story, though I did make a few tweaks. Kurama became serious and forgot his nickname. I was listening to their reactions to your story. It wasn't too bad, but you ruined it a bit by not remembering the seal Madara placed on you. The issue is the Uzumaki. Naruto's cheeks were puffy. It wasn't her fault that Tobirama was so perceptive. Really, if she hadn't pulled her hair over her other shoulder, he wouldn't have noticed the less than an inch of it that was visible from underneath her shirt. He seemed to let her get away with it for the time being, even though he was clearly aware that she was lying. Then she woke up, wondering what the issue might be and truly excited to meet her ancestors. What about them? They will find the seal that holds me and they will know what it is. Your father got the framework of the seal from your mother, who got it from her clan. There will be no hiding what it does when they find it, same with the one on your back. That's the reason the Nidame didn't press you on the lie. What was the point when seal masters were coming that would say what it was anyway? Kurama clarified. Wait, she interrupted. If they can find out what the seals do, how do we keep them from telling Hashirama and Tobirama? You said they'd find out eventually, but it seems too soon. Behind him, Kurama's tails whipped. Everything I said was basically guesswork. By the way they reacted to you in the future, they knew you were from there, but none of them said anything to give clues about when they find out or how long you stayed here. They could find out in a week or months. Though I'm leaning towards a week, he said with a frustrated grin. Naruto combed through her hair in frustration. If Hashirama and Tobirama find out I'm from the future eventually, why are we even bothering with this story? Kurama took a slow breath. After giving it some thought, Naruto sheepishly scratched her cheek while averting Kurama's eyes. How would you react if someone you found in the woods told you they were from the future? She asked. Yeah. We need to gain their trust first so they have reason to believe you and help you. You may be lying to them now, but they would understand the necessity when they find out the truth. With a sigh, Naruto dropped her head into her hands. What do I do when the Uzumaki know? How can I convince them to listen? As he thought, Kurama hummed, which sounded like a poor euro, not that she would say that to his face. I'm going to show myself, so you need to let me take over when I tell you. I can explain what I know of the seal to them. Seals aren't really my forte, he reluctantly admitted. I can tell what they do after some study, but I never really bothered to understand how they worked. Try to get them to examine the seals privately, out of sight of the Senju, to at least give us some idea of how long we'll be here. With immense relief that she had made friends with Kurama, Naruto nodded. Otherwise, she would be stumbling around, confused and lost, destroying the past in the process. Instead, despite the fact that it was primarily a reaction to what was happening to them, she has him help her decide what to do. She wanted to wake up, so she left her mindscape with only a grateful smile at Kurama, even though she was tempted to thank him because his responses to being thanked were always hilarious. It took a while to wake up this time. One sense at a time, she slowly woke up from her slumber. Prior to hearing the gentle sounds of the fire crackling and Tobirama breathing, she first felt the futon beneath her, the blanket over her, and the residual heat from the fire. Slowly opening her eyes, she could see that it was almost dawn, the time she usually woke up. When she looked for Tobirama without shifting, she discovered that he had hardly left his spot against the wall, with the pillow still behind his shoulders. She could tell he was awake because of his slightly erratic breathing, even though his arms were crossed, his eyes were closed, and his chin was tucked to his chest. If anything, he appeared to be in a state of mild meditation, resting both his body and his mind while remaining conscious of what was happening. Still amazed that this was actually one of the Hokage in front of her, she gazed at him openly. She reflected on yesterday and how surreal it still felt to be in this circumstance. She only registered that she wasn't where she last remembered and that someone was close to her because she had been confused when she had first woken up here and had forgotten her conversation with Kurama. Her eyes were red when she opened them, and that was that. Only after seeing Tobirama's face did she truly recall everything Kurama had said, having fled in panic. She had been in a state of shock and awe, staring at the face that had been watching over the village her entire life, when all of Kurama's words suddenly came flooding back. She couldn't help but stare at him now because a stone carving was so different from a real person or reanimation, and she hadn't spent much time with the reanimated Tobirama before being sent back. Like Kakashi Sensei, he was pale and had spiked silver hair, which accentuated the red marks on his cheeks and chin, just as his red eyes did. His eyes were more of a brilliant ruby than the blood red of the Sharingan. His strong jaw, pointed chin, high cheekbones, and slanted eyes all contributed to his narrow face. Although his face was naturally serious, it wasn't as stern as the monument depicted him to be. The same was true of Hashirama, who choked back a fangirl. Like squeal upon seeing him because two of her idols were standing actually Olivia in front of her. His picture and face in the Hokage's office gave the impression that he was much more serious than he actually was. However, the monument's faces weren't carved to appear kind and joyful. Tobirama was more lean and hard. Muscled than bulked up, like the majority of shinobi she had seen. Like most ninja, he was much stronger than he appeared, but she had heard Ino describe it as a runner's or swimmer's build. She felt that he was made of hard muscle that had barely strained to hold her still because she had been pressed up against him in the awkward way that he had caught and pinned her. To be honest, he was attractive. She was less interested in men than the majority of girls her age, but that did not imply she was ignorant of them. She was well aware that by most people's standards, all of her male friends from the village and many others were attractive. She was aware that Gaara was attractive even without eyebrows and that Kakashi Sensei was a pretty sight behind the mask. Regardless of what Sakura said about their relationship, she knew he wasn't in love with her. Like most of the guys she knew, Gaara could be an overprotective bastard, but they were just close friends at virtually siblings. She truly felt sorry for Temari. Heck, after her hormones kicked in, she gave Itachi a serious look and felt much less guilty about finding him attractive after finding out the truth. Additionally, it appears that Itachi didn't put on his masks because he was cool during their altercation after being resurrected and realizing she knew the truth. Surprisingly sassy, but when she thinks about it, it's funny. Go back to Tobirama. When she recalled that Kurama claimed to have created the shadow clones, she developed a strong admiration for him. She was extremely grateful because without that jutsu, she was essentially stripped of her entire arsenal. She became even more interested in him after they spoke yesterday and she was able to gauge his personality. She felt that he was concealing a warm and passionate personality that she couldn't see because they were practically strangers, and he resembled Kakashi in terms of seriousness. When he wasn't being lazy or perverted. Even though that would have been the standard for this period, the fact that he was now treating her gently was a clear indication that he wasn't cold or cruel. She wanted to carry on their brief exchange of 20 questions. She could learn more about the era she was in and, more crucially, what not to do. It was the best way to read each other. She also had a strong desire to know Tobirama and Hashirama as more than resurrected zombies and stern faces on the mountain. Despite knowing that Tobirama was likely aware that she had been up for a while, she made the decision to move forward and began to stretch languidly. Her body no longer ached from the hours of fighting and the entire chakra draining seal. She felt fully recovered. She stretched her muscles gradually, beginning with her toes and working her way up to her fingers. She then arched her back until it popped and moaned as she fell to the ground. She was undoubtedly feeling better. Even her stamina and chakra were being strained as she battled the resurrected Jinchuriki, 5 Biju, Obito, Madara, and the Jubi all at once without stopping. When she heard shifting, she turned to see Tobirama grinning and staring at her with amusement in his eyes. She pushed herself up and shrugged. "I feel better. I was exhausted yesterday." Tobirama stood up after nodding his head. "You've been awake for a while." She ducked her chin slightly and used her fingers to brush out her hair before putting it back in a braid. "Yeah, I was thinking about some things." "What things?" he inquired as he went to the kitchen to gather food ingredients. She took a moment to recall what Yuro, or rather, Wo Yuro, had been on her mind. She turned away from him and pulled out her storage scrolls to make it look like she was doing something else because she could feel herself blushing. Since she was naturally honest and terrible at lying, she followed Kurama's advice and only revealed a portion of the truth. "You and Hashirama mostly. And what will happen after the Uzumaki come?" Tobirama turned and smiled softly at her. "Nothing will happen to you right now, even if they can't do anything to help you. You are under the protection of my clan and we won't turn you away because of whatever may happen." Naruto felt a knot in his stomach. She was terrible at lying because of this. Her guilt tore at her until she told the truth after people fell for her lies and then behaved so kindly as a result. Not yet, she was reminded by Kurama. "Change the topic. Let's say you are aware that they are keeping you safe from other clans. Hold off on speaking until I've spoken with the Uzumaki." Naruto fought the impulse to nod. "I know you don't want the other clans to get me and be able to use me. That's the main reason why you won't turn me away." That. She wasn't sure what else would make the conversation tense enough for him to switch topics. Halfway through lowering a plate, she noticed Tobirama pause. Only a few seconds passed before he completed his work, shut the cabinet, and turned to her. He had maintained the same serious expression throughout the majority of her interrogation. "That is true. We don't want you falling into the hands of our enemies and let them gain control of your power. I won't lie and say that if it comes down to it, we won't do whatever it takes to prevent that." Tobirama hesitated, his mouth hanging open as if he were about to say something else, but he stopped and returned his attention to the light breakfast he was preparing. She remained silent, unsure of how to react to that. For the remainder of the morning, she pondered what more he would say. Following Tobirama's statement, the majority of that morning was spent in silence as neither party knew how to start a conversation. They spent a few hours doing various small tasks in silence, including eating and cleaning up. It was merely a simple question with monosyllabic responses, if they spoke at all. Naruto talked to Kurama or worried about her friends most of the time. Although she couldn't guess what his thoughts were about, Tobirama appeared to be just as absorbed in them. She thought she was going to blow up around noon. She could never sit quietly for hours on end doing nothing. She knew she would break soon because her leg was already bouncing and her fingers were tapping. She felt like she would lose her mind if she didn't get up and do something now that she had regained her energy. "Can we go outside?" When her voice abruptly broke the silence, Tobirama actually jumped, startled, and blinked, waking up from his reverie and recalling what she had asked. "Yeah, for a while, but if I tell you to go inside you must." She nodded, grabbing her shoes in her hand and making her way to the door, although she was too nervous to care and was internally irritated by the restriction. Tobirama, who was her shadow, silently followed. She stepped out into the warm sunlight and fresh air, pushing aside any irritation toward the future Hokage. Although she hadn't really noticed her surroundings yesterday, the cabin was in a pleasant, remote location with big trees all around and a small creek flowing through it. The leaves were beginning to turn the golden dot red color that Fire Country was known for, and the air was a little chilly because it was mid-October. Without even putting on her shoes, she left them by the door and ventured outside to the warmest, sunniest location she could find, relishing the sensation of the dirt and grass beneath her feet. She plopped down on her back in a location she thought appropriate, ignoring Tobirama Yuro. Not ignoring, but ignoring nonetheless, since she knew exactly where he was and how he was standing. She just breathed and closed her eyes, allowing herself to lose herself in her memories and enjoy the sun. One day in the academy, she recalled, She and Shikamaru had skipped class, and he had shown her how to gaze at clouds. She slept more often than she watched clouds, but she recalled Shikamaru telling her that she always stretched out like a cat or curled up in the sun, or on him, much to his fake annoyance. The recollection caused a smile to tug at her lips. She and Shikamaru had been close during their early academy years, primarily because they consistently skipped class. In fact, Shikamaru had begun teaching her to read after realizing she had never been taught. He told Iruka-sensei when he was too tired of it, and then he took control. During the academy and after teams were assigned, she and Shikamaru had become even more estranged. She didn't start hanging out with the others until after the Chunin exams. Iruka-sensei comes to mind when one thinks of the academy. The fact that he had remained on Turtle Island was greatly appreciated by her. Fighting in the war with Sakura, Chan, Kakashi, Sensei, and everyone else there putting their lives in danger for her was already difficult enough. She had no idea what she would have done if Iruka had been present and had been killed in front of her. She loved him so much that she questioned whether his passing would have driven her over the edge the way Neji's nearly did. He was her friend, her father, her teacher, and her big brother. She pushed her thoughts away from him as she felt her throat tighten and her eyes sting. She thought of his body in her arms, the faint smile that vanished from his face after he had shielded her and his seal. In an attempt to relax, she pressed her palms into her eyes and took a slow, trembling breath. The idea of Iruka-sensei or anyone else dying while she was stranded here made her heart feel like it was being brutally crushed, and she hadn't had time to cope with Neji's passing. She tried her best to express her gratitude to Kurama after feeling a soft thread of chakra send a rush of warmth through her. She remembered Tobirama's presence and lowered her hands when she felt in control once more. A few feet away from her, Tobirama sat cross-legged with his back turned appreciatively. Though she hoped he didn't inquire, she was thankful that he had at least given her the appearance of privacy while her feelings overcame her. If he did, she was at a loss for words. She sat up and began tearing up grass blades in an attempt to clear her mind and avoid making a mess. Even before she learned to meditate, she used to relax by doing something small with her hands. She tried to focus on her thoughts, ignoring Tobirama even though she knew he was turning around and observing her. She tore the grass to tiny shreds and asked nervously, "Nay, Tobirama?" She glanced in his direction. He was already observing her with a kind, perceptive gaze. Knowing he wouldn't ask her now, she gave him a gentle smile. She went on at his encouraging nod. "What can we do around here? I know we can't really leave this place, but is there anything we can do that wouldn't draw too much attention?" Tobirama crossed his arms, a habit she noticed he frequently displayed. They both silently decided not to discuss what had just transpired. When she asked him, he shook his head. "There's not much, honestly. Your chakra's sealed, and though this area is remote, any flares of chakra would draw attention. I mostly come here to relax or work on developing jutsu." She sulked. "Can I go through my katas at least? I just want to move." Tobirama stood up after nodding. "That's not a bad idea, I'll join you." Although she was taken aback, she remained silent in case he had second thoughts. She stood up, and they positioned themselves so that they were not in each other's way. She largely ignored him for the next hour. As she performed form after form, she enjoyed the steady use of her muscles and the warmth of the sun. The workout felt fantastic and relieved any residual stiffness from her recuperation, but it wasn't enough to make her breathless. She was able to relax both mentally and emotionally thanks to the repetitive motion. She had worked up a little perspiration and felt the calmest and most in control since coming here when she made the decision to end her life. She turned to see Tobirama sitting in the shade against the cabin wall, observing her, after failing to see him standing with her in the open space. She was unaware of how long he had been watching and had not noticed that he had stopped. To relieve the strain on her neck and aid in cooling down, she reached back to her hair and pulled it over her shoulder. She inquired, "How long were you watching?" He gave a shrug. "Only a few minutes. What kind of taijutsu did you learn? I've never seen that kind of style." Beside him, Naruko fell to the ground and leaned against the wall. Naruko smiled as she recalled her first taijutsu spar with Jiraiya. "It's something Jiraiya helped me develop. Back when I was a kid, my taijutsu was pretty bad. It was basically brawling. My instincts and stamina are the main reason I won any physical fights." He was especially happy when he practically hammered the new style into her, and he had been appalled. "The first year I traveled with him, he actually took me to see some geisha to learn how to dance and balance properly. After I learned what he wanted, he worked with me and we developed a style that worked with my height and instincts." Tobirama appeared taken aback. "You learned how to dance from geisha?" Naruko gave him a narrowed look. The women she had met there were among the most compassionate people she had encountered during her training trip, so he had better not harbor any animosity toward geisha. Yeah, I did. Tobirama raised a hand between them and shook his head, as if he could tell by her tone what she was thinking. I don't mean that in a negative way, I was just surprised. That's a very unorthodox way to learn. With a smile on her lips, she snorted. You try moving even a little bit in those outfits. Jiraiya had to stay there until I could do their hardest dance in full costume and not stumble or have anything fall off. And let me tell you, those headpieces were heavy. When we left he kept saying those women had tortured some grace into me because everything about how I walked and fought had changed. He lifted both hands in surrender and grinned at her challenging look. I see your point, I won't say another word. I would like to see it firsthand though. She knitted her brow. Firsthand? Would you want to spar with me? Isn't that too risky? Tobirama brushed his legs off and forced himself to stand. It should be fine as long as we stick to taijutsu, no weapons or chakra enhancements. Almost leaping back to her feet, she smiled. With a warning gesture toward him, she continued, as long as we understand that. And no going easy on me because I'm a girl, I'm stronger than I look. He grinned. I know better than to underestimate an opponent, even a shrimp like you. She gaped, wondering why his sense of humor had chosen to show up at this particular moment. Then she twitched her eyebrows and gave him a fierce glare. Making a remark about her height was the one thing that would definitely make her angry. Among her friends, she remained the shortest. Every time they went anywhere together, Kakashi Sensei would constantly rest his elbow on her head, which greatly irritated her. What made male shinobi so incredibly tall? In all seriousness, Sakura mentioned that the average adult male height was 6 feet. Women typically stood 5 feet 6, but because of her childhood stunted growth, she was only 5 feet 4. Although she wasn't particularly short, she was shorter than most people, especially those she spent time with, and she detested those 2 inches. She yelled at him, "It's not my fault you're such a giant," and assumed a sparring position. With a grin that never left his face, Tobirama followed her example. Despite being aware that Kurama was being duped and would fall for it head over heels, Naruto chose to ignore her mental eye roll. She lunged at him as soon as he was upright, delivering a spin kick that he deftly sidestepped. Not to be discouraged, she settled into her own taijutsu style. In the ensuing adrenaline rush, they lost track of time as they swiftly settled into a pattern during their sparring. She sincerely appreciated the dancing lessons. Her style was fluid and quick, emphasizing speed over power, as she had honed her movements and was able to incorporate some acrobatics with what Jiraiya had taught her. By the time the old pervert finished with her, she had adopted an avoidance style that suited her smaller frame by employing evasive maneuvers rather than blocking. They added rolls and other acrobaticas to help her get under and into her opponent's guard, as well as swiftly move out of range after attacking them, by working with her lower center of gravity. She was able to maintain her balance and recover from takedowns thanks to the deliberate motions she learned in the dancing classes. Her specialty was swift and unpredictable attacks, which were essential to this style. According to Ero Sennin, she was able to move and balance in ways that even he couldn't predict very well because of her flexibility and agility. As a result, she was able to change her trajectory by flipping over Tobirama using his shoulders, instead of kicking at his head. The jerk jumped over her as she lowered herself into a crouch and spun around him, sweeping her legs on the ground. She would have been face planted in the ground quite spectacularly if she had attempted such a move as a fresh genin. She attempted to breach Tobirama's defenses using what she had learned. She was able to dodge his own offensive attacks, and the only time she was hit was when he grazed her hip, but she was also unable to hit him once. Although he lacked her flexibility, he was at least as fast as her. He had lightning fast reflexes and was able to use her own momentum against her, even though she was able to duck, flip, cartwheel, and fly around him. Your father's Hiroshin was made by Tobirama, who is undoubtedly one of the fastest shinobi in existence. Your father outperformed him, but he enhanced Tobirama's concept and design, Kurama said, echoing her ideas. Unfortunately, she stumbled due to the shock of Kurama's statement and his abrupt interruption of her thoughts, and Tobirama quickly took advantage of the situation. He was crouching over her, pressing an arm to her throat, and she was on her back in a flash of silver and blue. Since they had been fighting for some time, their breathing had become a little heavier, but due to the spar's limitations, they had hardly perspired. With a groan, Naruto extended her hands in a gesture of submission, palms up. It was embarrassing to trip without cause during a spar, and she couldn't even tell him that she was constantly thinking about Biju Radio and its typically sarcastic commentary. Grinning, Tobirama stood up and extended his hand for her to grasp. She allowed him to pull her to her feet. Your style is incredible. I've never seen something that was so hard to predict. Her smile was sad but loving. Jiraiya was relentless in that, so I'd be able to defend myself, she said. With a nod acknowledging her feelings, Tobirama began to return to the cabin, and she followed, relieved that their relationship was no longer tense. She thought it wouldn't hurt to continue their questions from the previous evening, since she was still unsure of what to do to kill time. So, what is Hashirama like? He held the door open for her and turned to face her with a raised eyebrow. That's kinda random. She tossed her shoes inside and shrugged, tying her fingers behind her back. Didn't have any idea what to do for the rest of the day, so I figured continuing asking questions was a way to pass the time. He acknowledged by dipping his head. Ah. She eagerly glanced at him. She recalled the time Edo Hashirama had arrived and Madara had rushed in, ready for a brawl. When Hashirama pointed to the Uchiha, said, "Not now," and blatantly ignored him, she couldn't help but smile. She truly wanted to learn more about the person who could make a guy like Madara look like that because of the priceless expression on his face. So, as they sat at the table, Tobirama poured 2 glasses of water from the tap and gave her one. He said, "Well, he's an idiot, with all the affection of a younger sibling. He can be overbearing and a mother-hen. You'll probably see it soon enough, but he gets depressed at the slightest things and then he bounces back in minutes like nothing ever happened. He's pretty easy going most of the time, though he knows when to take things seriously. He's strong." Tobirama smiled proudly. "He's the strongest man I know, and he's not afraid to stand up for what he thinks is right, even to family. He never gives up on the people he cares about, and he has a way of making people listen and follow him." Tobirama stopped talking and motioned for him to ask her a question. Being thoughtful, he continued, "What was Jiraiya like? I understand if you don't want to talk too much about him." Naruto concentrated on all of her favorite memories. "He was crazy," she began, smiling. With her signature prankish smile, she continued, "He was a blatant pervert. I first met him when he was peeping on the woman's bath. I screamed and watched as he got beat up. He had no shame, going around calling himself a super pervert, but he was also one of the nicest men I knew. He was goofy most of the time, but he was serious when the situation called for it, and he was incredibly smart and good with seals. He gave me those scrolls," she said, indicating that the futon was that they were sitting on. "He was freakishly good at sneaking in places and gathering information on anyone or anything that might have been happening." Particularly when she described Tobirama as being such an open pervert, her face was priceless. She wrapped up because she was at a loss for words that would fit her cover. "He protected me with his life, and he was the closest thing I've ever had to a father." Tobirama folded his arms and reclined in his chair. Ignoring some of his quirks, he seemed like a good man. "Your turn, now." As she was at a loss for ideas, she recalled the introduction of Team 7, hobbies. He combed his hair with his hand. "Don't really have time for much with all the fighting, but I guess mine would be training and developing jutsu. Yours?" Her playful smile returned. She laughed inwardly at the anxious expression on his face and said, "Pranks. I love playing pranks on people." She is aware that her sly smile frightens people, but it's good to know that Hokage finds it amusing as well. "I also like to train, meditate, and draw. When you live alone you do almost anything to stop being bored. Drawing and gardening were 2 things I enjoyed a lot." Dislikes? Her smile caused Tobirama to veer slightly away from her, but he remained distant. "I guess all the fighting and anyone who poses a threat to my family. What are yours?" It didn't even require much thought on her part. People who put others down to make themselves feel superior, harm those precious to me, or can't look underneath the underneath. When she finished speaking, he tilted his head. "Underneath the underneath? Where'd you hear something like that?" Her eyes grew wide as she tried to think of a way to justify her slip. How was she going to describe Kakashi? "Sensei. When Jiraiya and I were traveling we ran across a man. I'm guessing he was a retired shinobi or an orphan. We stuck with him a while and he taught me things like that, said they were things his teacher taught him. I hoped he wouldn't probe too deeply. What do you mean by it?" "No luck," she said, the first thing that came to mind as her mind raced to find something. "I guess it'd be like my village. I wish they could have looked underneath the fact that I absorbed the chakra and see me instead of the fox reincarnated." He remarked, "Makes sense. Anything else this man taught you like that?" She nodded, seeing no harm in sharing the most significant lesson she had ever learned from Kakashi. "Sensei. What stuck with me the most was when he said, 'Those who break the rules are trash, but those who abandon their comrades are worse than trash.'" He raised both eyebrows to his bangs. "Not something you usually hear around here. What was his name?" "Katake," she blurted, trying not to mess anything up by combining his first and last name. We never said our last names. Tobirama gave a sympathetic nod. So, I guess it's your turn. She asked the first simple question that came to mind, grateful for the change of topic. Favorite season? He shrugged and said, autumn. I like how the leaves change. What about you? Same. I love how the leaves look like fire, all the reds, yellows, and oranges, and sometimes I get to play in leaf piles with other kids, she replied. Find out how old he is. Kurama remarked hastily, it will help me know how far back we came. Without pausing, she inquired, how old are you? She was becoming so good that she might become an actress when she returned in the future. 20.1. Hashirama's 23, he continued. She projected back to Kurama, tell me later, as she needed her focus on the discussion. She couldn't afford to have her focus divided because of how easily they could touch delicate subjects. Anything else you want to know? He said, I don't think I ever asked your favorite color. He was presumably having as much trouble coming up with ideas as she was. This one was always simple. Orange. He glanced at her orange jacket near her belongings. So that's why. Not very practical for a ninja. She laughed. Please, by the time I was 10 I was able to paint all over buildings, in the open, without being seen by the villagers, all in a neon orange jumpsuit. My stealth and traps rock when I feel like it. And I don't really like bright orange, like the fruit, I like sunset orange, she added. Few people were aware of this unusual fact. Tobirama backed off once more. Please don't prank me, my brother you can go all out on. The obvious way he threw his brother to the wolves made her laugh aloud. It would feel good to find new targets because she hadn't had the opportunity to prank anyone in a while. No promises. Even though Tobirama winced, he was grinning because he relished the lighthearted taunting. Your turn. She pushed up from the table and shrugged. I honestly can't think of anything that wouldn't touch sensitive subjects. What about you? He got up and prepared wood for when it grew dark, following her example. The same. I'm usually here alone or with Hashirama. On the futon, Naruto flopped shamefully. I hate being interrogated. It's so boring. Tobirama let out a loud, deep laugh. She couldn't help but think that he had a great laugh as she looked at him and saw how his entire face brightened when he was pleased about something. You're probably the first to complain that interrogation is boring. To hide her blush from him, she rolled her eyes and turned her face away. Well, it is. I'm not stupid. I know you're supposed to use the time until the Uzumaki show to get information out of me, but I'm honestly bored. His offer was, I could always torture you if you want. She protruded her tongue in a mature gesture. I'm used to moving around, training, or sparring. I hate having nothing to do. It drives me crazy faster than any torture ever would. Good to know, he acknowledged, his smile remaining intact. Then, as if he had just realized something, he straightened up a little and said, I should probably ask you what jutsu you know. Whoa. Here's a little assistance, Kurama. Rasengan ought to be secure. Most of them can now be completed without clones, but the Rasen Shuriken cannot be used because it can only be used safely in Sage mode. Any wind technique, including Henge and Kawarimi, should be safe, but don't do clones in front of him, he said hastily, attempting to avoid giving the impression that her silence was suspicious. Tobirama appeared perplexed when Naruto explained the techniques to him and what a Rasengan was, but he appeared genuinely surprised when she was finished. That's all you know? How many Futon jutsu do you know? He inquired. She shrugged, nervously massaging the back of her neck. Not any specific ones, really. I just focus on using my wind chakra and I can slash my arm through the arm and create an attack. Tobirama's mouth dropped slightly. Imitating the gesture, he said, just slashing your arm through the air? She gave a nod. And you can create blasts of wind just by doing that, another wink. I've also used it with my taijutsu, extending my range or adding more force behind my attacks. I've also channeled my chakra through kunai and used them that way, she clarified. Normal kunai? Not special ones made for channeling nature affinities? He demanded. His eyes were a little wide as he slumped back against the wall when she nodded once more. Do you know how rare innate control of an affinity is? The new term made her tilt her head. Innate control? He gave a nod. Most shinobi train to learn multiple jutsu for their elemental affinity so that it's more powerful, but even veteran shinobi have a hard time using jutsu for their element without hand signs. The most people are able to do is shorten the hand signs to just one to get the jutsu they want, but you can use your wind techniques without any signs at all, just focusing it to parts of your body and then channeling it outwards. Is this making sense to you? Slowly, she nodded. So basically, instead of using hand signs to focus my affinity, I'm just using it naturally by focusing on making it do what I want instead of a specific jutsu. He gave a nod. Basically, it's extremely rare for someone to have such innate knowledge of how to use their affinity that way. Some shinobi can do it after years of training with their affinity, but the way you've explained it, you have never learned any specific jutsu for wind chakra. You just channel it to parts of your body and will it to do what you want. As she pondered, she folded her arms. She had simply thrown her arm in front of her, allowing the wind to attack him, whenever she wished to use her wind chakra outside of the Rasen Shuriken, such as during her battle with Obito. In all honesty, she was unable to recall a single time when she had truly employed hand signals or wind jutsu. Gaining control over my chakra greatly enhanced your ability to control your own, and this was further enhanced when we agreed to collaborate. You couldn't have controlled the tails around individual people at the same time and formed cloaks around an entire army a month ago. It only makes sense that you would have better control over your own chakra, Kurama said. You can strengthen it by working on this, but you should also focus on learning Fuden Jutsu. Recognizing that Tobirama was observing her intently, she forced herself not to nod. I never realized that's what I was doing. Hey, why were you so surprised that that's all I knew? We're constantly fighting against other clans, so shinobi usually have a very large arsenal of attacks from taijutsu, genjutsu, ninjutsu, and kenjutsu. To hear that you just have the basics with a handful of offensive ninjutsu is shocking considering how much you traveled, he clarified. She stammered, anxiously. I only know how to use kunai and shuriken and I suck at genjutsu. I can recognize them okay and dispel them alright, but I can't cast them. When he spoke to her, Tobirama appeared shocked, which was something that was starting to happen. Really? Not even a sword? She gave a headshake. Perhaps if she played her cards right, she could get him to teach her. Never really had the money to get one and Jiraiya didn't know how to use one either, at least that I knew of. She genuinely wanted to learn a little after seeing Sasuke wielding his sword, but she wasn't sure if it was the right weapon for her. She was always more of a hands-on fighter and had always felt at ease using kunai. But if the need arose, it wouldn't hurt to know how to use one. How on earth did you survive? Tobirama questioned questioningly. You don't have any armor other than mesh, almost no ninjutsu outside of the basics, and no knowledge of weapons outside of shuriken and kunai. Your taijutsu is incredible, but I've never seen someone so unprepared for this world before. You don't realize how correct you are, she reflected. You're not very subtle, you know. Naruto let out a half-strangled yelp, so shocking that Tobirama looked at her with alarm. He laughed again when he saw the ashamed flush creeping up her neck. Disregarding the embarrassing sound, she placed her hands on her hips. It's not like I don't know what you're writing. It was accurate. Tobirama had openly informed Naruto that he was putting together all of his observations and everything she had told him in order to write a report about her. Because he had put his ideas on paper, he had even discovered some new things about her. Similar to what she had just shown, she was extremely immature and childish despite her extensive training and the profundity of her beliefs. Just because you are what I'm writing about doesn't give you permission to read it, he calmly stated. He liked to think he knew how to resist her quirks, and this was his third day alone with her. Since yesterday's interrogation wasn't pleasant for either of them, he was genuinely relieved that she was once again being mischievous. He had made the decision to be direct and ask her for any information she could provide about the Kyuubi's chakra in her body, including how it affected her and what situations triggered it. The only compromise she requested was to withhold names, even though she knew she couldn't avoid answering. She told him about the times the chakra took over, since he was capable of doing that much. He was informed that the first time it occurred, she believed her friend had been killed in front of her, and the chakra responded to her anger by giving her the extra speed and aggression she needed to overwhelm her opponent. However, she quickly recovered before striking the fatal blow. When he had questioned her about why she hadn't followed through, she had shrugged. I had met him the day before. I didn't know who he was, but he did and didn't kill me. Instead he asked me what I fought for, and it was because of him that I found an answer. I fight to protect the people precious to me. Tobirama accepted yesterday that he would always be taken aback by her. Tobirama looked at the note he had written next to that report today. There are no rumors or reports about her anywhere, but is she an accomplished spy and actor, or is she telling the truth? He sincerely hoped Naruto had told the truth about everything. Since she would only be killed as a last resort due to the chakra inside her, he didn't want to consider what they would do to her if it turned out that she was a spy. He could acknowledge to himself that he had been incredibly stupid over the last few days, becoming easily enamored with the girl or simply the Fa section aid she was putting on. Stop that, he yelled at the girl, his tone influenced by his thoughts. He had to stoop over the paper and attempt to conceal what he had written with his hand as she tried to peek over his shoulder at the scroll. With her hands open and raised by her waist, Naruko jerked back from him. Okay, calm down, I'll stop. Tobirama watched her, keeping his emotions and thoughts hidden by carefully regulating his facial expression. Curling her legs to the side and avoiding eye contact, Naruko retreated and took a seat on the futon. He let out a sigh and returned his focus to the report, going over his notes and comparing them with what he recalled she had told him. She had largely been in control of herself, with the exception of her initial use of the chakra, which she only vaguely described the following few times. He soon discovered that it was simpler to access when her life was in jeopardy or when her emotions particularly her anger were too intense. At the next section, Tobirama winced at the clear indications in his handwriting. Although Hashirama was able to read between the lines and his swift, harsh strokes conveyed his anger, there was no use in rewriting everything for that reason alone. When the Kyuubi's chakra first appeared physically around her body, she had described it to him. The first time she accessed the fox's chakra, she believed her friend had been killed after she had been deceived by him. She explained to him how she had chased after him after he had left to join an enemy, how they had fought, and how her friend would have killed her if it weren't for the fox's chakra. She only stated that she had lost the fight and nothing else. She went on to say that following that battle, it was remarkably simple for her to use enough chakra to create the cloak rather than enough to strengthen her body as she had initially done. Jiraiya had taken her to a remote location and given her even more access in an attempt to test her control over it. It was horrifying to hear her describe how her anger overcame her around Three Tails, how she began to lose her ability to recognize those around her, the damage done to her body at the fourth tail, and how she lost all control. It must have been traumatic for him to know what had happened because she had told him that part with shocking detachment, which was in stark contrast to her personality. He was aware of what she was doing separating, attempting to detach herself emotionally from her memories, and simply stating the facts because if she didn't, she would lose control of her day, which had been among her worst. She had been able to say that Jiraiya had stopped her, but that it had nearly killed him. Although her emotional state made it easy to access during periods of high stress, she said that was the last time she had intentionally used the chakra. The potential was frightening. Throughout the entire conversation, he had kept his attention on her chakra, and it hadn't changed in any way that would indicate she was lying. The remainder of yesterday had been spent mostly in silence, both of them deep in thought, after she had asked him for a break. In order to review and share with his brother, he had been jotting down all the information she had given him in this scroll. In the silence that followed their conversation, he added all the additional things he had noticed about her and the details she had shared with him about her past. His brother texted him first thing this morning to let him know that it was time to return and that he would remain with her until Mito showed up at the end of the week. For Mito to arrive so promptly and in person, Hashirama must have informed her about the Kyuubi's chakra and her potential ancestry. They must be exerting themselves if they are coming from Uzushio so fast. He had taken out the scroll to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything, and Naruko had chosen to be nosy. The message stated that he would arrive at noon. When Tobirama was certain of all he had recorded, he rolled up the scroll. He glanced at Naruko and noticed that her eyes were closed and her head was leaned back against the wall. He was aware that she wasn't asleep, but she must be meditating or unwinding because her breathing was steady and slow. Officially, Naruko was the most peculiar woman he had ever encountered. She could be very quiet, calm, and caring, but when she was excited, she was loud, brash, and a motormouth. Even among those trained as kunoichi, she was a far cry from the generally subdued woman he was accustomed to. The majority of women were only taught shinobi techniques for self-defense when clan conflicts became too personal, allowing them to defend both the clan and themselves. Men were the ones who were trained in combat, and even then, only a small number of those who demonstrated promise received additional training. The few women who received additional training were primarily trained in seduction and intelligence gathering. They were never as skilled frontline combatants as Naruko. Even the Uzumaki women weren't as outspoken as Naruko, despite their reputation for having tempers, which she had in abundance. Despite their unique chakras, durability, and fortitude, they concentrated more on employing seals in combat. Mito was the most successful woman he had encountered prior to Naruko, primarily due to the fact that she was among her clan's top seal masters and was skilled at using them to trap and debilitate her adversaries in combat. For this Jiraiya to have trained Naruko as a shinobi rather than merely a kunoichi, she must have demonstrated promise as a young girl. An orphan from a civilian village would be taken in and trained in the shinobi arts by very few, if any, people. Given that she was still alive despite lacking ninjutsu and kenjutsu, it is clear that the training paid off. But her taijutsu was something extraordinary. She would have taken him down in a few minutes if he hadn't dedicated his life to improving his speed. Avoiding her insane attacks, which were entirely unpredictable, was a true test of his reflexes and skill. She was doing one move when he thought she was doing another. If she hadn't lost her balance during their first spar, they most likely would have gone much longer. He was rapidly becoming fixated on solving the mystery that was her. She hesitated too long when answering him or paused erratically while performing mundane tasks. He gave her the impression that he didn't notice, just writing the observation in the scroll. It was almost as though she was hearing something that only she could hear, something that might actually happen depending on how strong the Kyuubi's chakra was. He was anything but stupid. Her story had too many gaps, too many instances where she was trained by enigmatic but seemingly talented shinobi who lived alone. They're all dead or beyond her reach. He was aware that she was telling the truth about Jiraiya and other people in her life being dead because the anguish he witnessed when they went outside for the first time was too genuine and unadulterated. The issue was that, despite having reportedly visited every country in the world, she never mentioned in her stories the names of the villages she visited. Additionally, he observed that the subtle presence of the fox's chakra he was watching would react when her emotions overcame her. She had mentioned that it reacted to intense emotions, so it wasn't particularly odd, but what baffled him was how it was reacting. If he hadn't been keeping an eye on it specifically for that reason, he wouldn't have noticed the chakra because it was so faint. The chakra was reaching out to her, but it wasn't leaking out of her body as if it wanted to harm, control, or flee. And each time this occurred, she either relaxed or shifted the conversation. He and Naruto were both startled out of their silence by a sudden burst of chakra. He waved her away when Naruto turned to him for directions. The flare's distance before his brother covered his chakra was Hashirama's way of alerting him that he was almost there. "It's Hashirama," he clarified. Naruto settled back down, though she didn't necessarily relax as much as she had previously. "Is he almost here then?" He gave a nod. "Yes, he'll be with you for the next few days until Mito arrives. I'll come back with her." He had already told her this several times, but he didn't mind because it seemed to calm her down. Naruto gave a nod, got to her feet, and hurried into the restroom. He heard the faucet turn on and gave her a few minutes to gather herself before he put on his armor again and got ready to go. Naruto emerged from the restroom after a last chakra flare. The shorter lengths of her hair hung in damp curls around her face, while the longer lengths were secured in a braid. Although there was no bathtub or shower here, they could easily clean up a little with running water. He rarely stayed here for long, and there was a spring a mile or so to the east if he wanted to wash up. "What is it about my brother that makes you so nervous?" asked the man. Although she was wringing her hands, Naruto shrugged. "I don't know, I've just heard rumors and gossip, stories really, about him and you, and I'm just nervous about being alone with him." Tobirama raised an eyebrow. "Hashirama?" It was almost comical that someone would feel uneasy around his brother away from combat. Then he realized something. "Were you nervous when you were left here alone with me?" Only because he knew Hashirama's chakra well did he sense his brother standing outside the door, listening. Naruto gave a shrug. "I was, yeah. I mean, Jiraiya told me he preferred for me to find you guys instead of the Uchiha, but he didn't know anything about you but what we would overhear other clans talk about. You guys have quite the reputation among the other clans." He needed to explain. "The only thing that made you nervous were our reputations? Nothing else?" Naruto cocked her head and furrowed her brow. He was genuinely stunned into silence, unable to respond, unable to comprehend that she could be that innocent, so naive, at her age. "No, what else would there be?" he asked. Naruto gasped as her eyes widened abruptly. Oh, no, 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 oh God, no, I'm so sorry, never, I never thought you, either of you, would. Oh, God, no." Hashirama decided to gently tap on the door and force it open at this precise moment, and he curses his foolish, intrusive brother and his perfect timing. It was obvious from his expression that he had been paying attention. "Am I interrupting anything?" Naruto buried her face in her hands and whimpered, her face flushed. "Oh, God." Tobirama agreed, despite his efforts to keep his cheeks from flushing. His brother merely smiled and shrugged, amusement shining in his eyes as he glared at him. He secretly felt relieved that Naruto never thought they would touch her for some crazy, foolish reason. In a circumstance like hers, that was typically something that all women feared. Hashirama was left to break the silence since neither he nor Naruto appeared to be able or willing to do so. Hashirama rolled his eyes, and Tobirama shot his brother a stern look. "Everything's set back at the clan. I'll be here until Mito arrives. When she gets here, come back out and we'll settle everything." 2 days, right? He asked explicitly. She sure is coming fast. How much did you tell her? With a shrug, his brother moved to the table. Enough. Although her face was still red and she was unable to look them in the eyes, Naruko appeared to have calmed down as she withdrew her face from her hands. Tobirama got up, conscious of Naruko's eyes following the movement anxiously, and slid the scroll across the table to his brother. Since their reaction to what was written would determine her future, he could appreciate her interest in the scroll. He stopped at the door and turned to face Naruko. The nervousness and embarrassment from earlier kept her quiet and reserved, and she was looking between him and Hashirama. He looked at her and gave her a comforting smile. He's harmless, trust me. I'll be back in 2 days, so don't get into any trouble. In return, she smiled softly and relaxed. See you then. He departed without observing the glance Hashirama exchanged with them. Hashirama gazed in disbelief at his brother's back until it disappeared behind the door. Had his stern, rule abiding, reclusive younger brother, Tobirama, simply reassured and consoled a pragmatic stranger. Since their brothers passed away, Tobirama had only ever been so honest about his feelings when he was around him. Even then, he had to work hard to get his brother to smile, which is rare. He never allowed his anger to control him. He only displayed it during combat. He was aware that his younger brother cherished him, but they were rarely together unless they were alone, aside from the occasional embrace. It was one of the reasons he always noticed that when he was around Tobirama, he had a tendency to fake being depressed. He saw the amusement in his eyes and the smile tugging at his lips, even though he frequently acted irritated and snapped at him to gain control. However, this girl made Tobirama smile in less than 3 days, and offering consolation. He was aware that a few days of solitude would help them become somewhat acquainted, and the conversation he overheard demonstrated this. In order to read the contents of the scroll, he nearly wanted to knock her out. He was curious if it contained any hints that would help him make sense of his brother's unusual actions. He could read the feelings behind his brother's writing because he knew him like the back of his hand. He looked at Naruko, who appeared uneasy around him despite Tobirama's assurances and was unsure of how to approach. No matter how funny it had been to hear, the embarrassment from earlier couldn't be helping. She looked into his eyes and met them. Even though he was looking at her in an evaluating manner, he was impressed by how evenly she maintained his gaze. He was said to be capable of a very menacing gaze. Her injuries were totally gone, and she looked much better after getting some rest and sleep. She was undoubtedly stunning. Aside from her gorgeous eyes, blonde hair, and whiskers, her personality was what truly set her apart. Her personality made her smile, despite the fact that he didn't know her personally and only knew her from her story in Interrogation. Even the smallest emotions were openly expressed by her, and her feelings guided every action she took. He and most likely Tobirama were drawn to that quality because, at the time, most people were aloof unless they were with family. Similar to Tobirama, he was very shocked that she was so. He wasn't sure if he should describe it as innocent or naive. She had never even considered the possibility that he or Tobirama would impose themselves on her. Before the age of 12, most women lose that kind of innocence. He had to admit that her innocence and stubbornness impressed him. She was clearly uncomfortable with the obvious staring, but she continued to hold his gaze. At last, his inhibitions gave way and he burst out laughing. The expression on her face then made him laugh even harder. He had to restrain himself for a few minutes because he kept seeing Naruko's puzzled face and the recollection of the talk with Tobirama kept making him lose his temper. He began taking off his armor once he had enough self-control. He wasn't sure if she understood, but it was a sign of trust. Despite the potentially dangerous nature of the information it contained, he glanced at the scroll that was sitting harmlessly on the table. Naruko said softly, "You can read it," and sat down on the futon. He scowled. Since this was not a typical scenario, he opened the scroll and began reading, keeping his senses on her even though he doubted she would approach. He genuinely wanted to get to know her the conventional way. There were some odd items on the scroll. It covered everything from her favorite food and color to her opinions on hate, peace, and her hometown. He carefully read the passages about Jiraiya, Katake, and his brother's notes and ideas. He had written a brief note next to the fact that she seemed to enjoy pulling practical jokes. It stated, "A child who was a troublemaker at Euro, possibly seeking attention by being disregarded, even if negatively." According to their descriptions, some of them possess stealth and trap-making abilities. He wouldn't have mistaken her for being stealthy for someone with Naruko's bright personality and presence, but if he paid any attention to his younger brother, he wasn't either. After reading Tobirama's comments about her taijutsu, he was genuinely taken aback and decided to spar with her. He was thrilled if Tobirama, who had spent his entire life honing his speed, struggled to land a hit. Even though he was one of the strongest shinobi of his generation, he had never used Sage Mode to match Tobirama's speed. As he read more, he scowled and thought it strange that Naruko only knew taijutsu. She had no genjutsu, no kenjutsu, only kunai and shuriken, and no armor that she could have purchased or scrounged. Rasengan, and its variants must be something, but he had no idea what they were. As soon as he could fully unseal her chakra, he wanted a demonstration. Her natural ability to control her wind element was also fascinating. He had to stifle a smile in his fist as he finished reading everything. He could read the feelings in his writing and knew exactly what was going on with his younger brother. There was a crush on his younger brother. He wasn't sure Tobirama had noticed yet, but the underlying meaning of the words made it obvious that he was interested. He had seen that the interest was reciprocal, at least. The dangers of shinobi life and the quick emotional development that shinobi went through are not understood by civilians, who also never comprehend how shinobi can declare love and get married before the age of 16. The risk of a partner dying on any mission made it all too common, and nobody gave it a second thought. He would even go so far as to say that shinobi are brought up to fall in love early and never hope to live long. It was normal for Naruto and his brother to have developed such a rapid attraction. He now sincerely hoped that Mito's arrival went smoothly. Given that Kami is aware that Tobirama deserves some light in his life, he would adore introducing Naruko to his brother. She would also undoubtedly be able to compete with his brother because her upbeat and kind nature would be the ideal counterpoint to Tobirama's somber and realistic, almost pessimistic, personality. Even if they were only friends, Naruko would undoubtedly show his passionate side, which only Hashirama and their close family would be able to see. Hashirama was forced to refrain from theatrically rubbing his hands together. He was eager to play the role of matchmaker. He genuinely believed that Tobirama would die a lonely bachelor and never meet anyone other than for the occasional night stand. He realized that Tobirama's personality, like his own, wasn't suited for passive women or those who were trying to move up the social scale after taking a closer look at Naruko and what he knew about her. Despite the fact that such women were uncommon at the time, they both favored independent-minded women who weren't afraid to express their opinions, could take care of themselves if necessary, and weren't using them for their own prestige. Although his engagement to Mito began as a political pact, they were now truly in love, and he could honestly state that he relished the challenge her obstinate personality offered. To keep from laughing again, he had to bite his cheek. To be honest, Tobirama didn't know what he was getting into. Without a doubt, Naruko was an Uzumaki, and she seemed to have plenty of the infamous rage and stubbornness. He couldn't help but huff a little laugh. The personalities that he and his brother sought to match them appeared to be unique to Uzumaki women. Before confronting Naruko, he rolled the scroll up and put it away with his armor. She had been silently waiting for him to finish reading. He wanted her to stop being so quiet and tense around him and instead relax. Since I know all that Tobirama does about you, feel free to ask me whatever you want. After giving him a quick glance, she obeyed. Favorite color? Green. Hobbies? Recalling the paragraph about her penchant for pulling practical jokes, he grinned. To be honest, he was interested in seeing if she could outsmart Tobirama. However, when she asked him, he shrugged. With the conflicts that arise in the leadership of my clan, I don't really have much time for hobbies, but I enjoy taking walks. She had relaxed from her tense sitting position and was leaning back against the wall, as if she were beginning to relax. What's it like, leading a clan? Slumping slightly in the chair, he sighed. It's not easy. To be honest, I wouldn't be aware of half of the political issues if it weren't for Tobirama. I'm not very good at it, he said, laughing, and it's stressful to know that everyone is looking to me for guidance or protection. People can die from a single error. Maintaining the safety of as many of them as possible is worth the heavy burden. Shinobi are those who endure for the sake of those we love and want to protect, she responded. You bear it so they don't have to. He had realized much the same thing, but he had never before found anyone else who had reached the same realization on their own, and his eyes widened. He nodded in acknowledgement, saying, and you endure the solitude and discrimination of holding the chakra of the Kyuubi. Tobirama had mentioned that she had moments when she seemed wise beyond her years, even in this time when children are taught to kill or die before they turn 10. It was understandable that she would be incredibly empathetic due to her past, though it was confusing that she wasn't jaded and angry. She grabbed her ankles and raised her knees to her chest while nodding. How are the Uzumaki? Her head jerked up, and she looked at him with wide eyes, saying, to be honest, we are fairly certain you're related to them. He shrugged at her expression, saying, it's not really considered a bloodline, but all Uzumaki have a distinct feel to their chakra, special abilities that vary among them, as well as longevity and incredible durability. For us, your story essentially proved it. A Uzumaki would be the only person capable of handling a Biju's chakra, much less a Kyuubi's. Your father or mother was probably a member of the clan. That wasn't what your question was, though, he said, hoping that she would be thrilled about the possibility of finding blood family and that any positive ties she might have to them are leads they need to follow. The Uzumaki clan values family and is very close knit. They fiercely defend those they own. They don't have the most potent techniques, but they can still be dangerous because they concentrate on seals and using them in combat. He gestured to her, and she reached up to tug at her braid. With the occasional exception, most Uzumaki have red hair in some shade. It's a pretty dominant gene. The person coming is our friend Mito. Reminiscent of his first encounter with the famous temper, he added wryly, the clan's women have a bit of a reputation. They are known for their vicious nature when defending those they care about, and their tempers in general. One of the most transparent clans I've ever encountered is the Uzumaki clan. What does open mean to you? After letting go of her curled up position and practically hanging on to his every word, she asked. He gestured at nothing in particular with his hands. Most shinobi hide their feelings when facing adversaries or even allies. Though some may be more calm than others, the Uzumaki always express their feelings honestly and passionately. For a few years, the Senju and Uzumaki clans have been close allies. She nodded, absorbing everything, and he gave her some space to collect her thoughts. What was Tobirama like as a child? At last, she inquired. It was a clever way to get a picture of someone if they were honest, asking other people what they thought of them. He wondered when she would ask that. Tobirama had written that she had asked him about his childhood with Hashirama as his brother, so it would only be a matter of time until he was asked the same question about Tobirama. Like Tobirama, he saw no harm in giving her general information, nothing particularly telling or dangerous. Even so, he couldn't help but smile. He's not much different actually, he said, adding that he rarely had the opportunity to bug anyone about Tobirama other than Mito or Tobirama when he saw her. He was a very serious child who hardly ever did anything but read, learn, and train. He is strict but encouraging. Though he usually considers his options before acting, he can be stubborn and headstrong. He believes the only way to have peace is for everyone to follow a set of rules, that it would only work if everyone did it. It's one of the reasons he doesn't believe in it, I think. He thought. Trying to get all shinobi, people who work and live in the shadows, who betray and lie and steal for a living, to follow a set of rules isn't really something I can see happening without some major event to give them a reason to listen. Before he could read it, he saw Naruko's face contort into an expression he couldn't recognize because it was concealed. He went on as if he hadn't seen anything, but it was kind of odd that she would respond to that. He's very loyal to those he cares about, and very protective. Even though he's very serious, he's actually a very passionate person, especially when it comes to something he cares about, he said. Naruko's description of Tobirama made him smile. That much was clear. There was a mutual interest going on there. Something seemed to have been triggered by leaving them alone together for nearly 3 days. She was astute enough to know not to probe further until they had verified her honesty, so she asked only straightforward questions. He liked her because, in terms of personality, she was similar to him. She opened up to him after she felt at ease with him. In a world where deceit reigns, she was a very straightforward individual who was extremely honest and open. Since civilian villages could frequently become collateral damage regardless of the measures taken to avoid them, he inquired later in the day, in the early evening, how she had managed to avoid the fighting. Avoiding his gaze, Naruko shrugged and took hold of her elbow with her right hand. A side effect from the fox's chakra is some sensory ability. The Kyuubi can feel hate and negative emotions most strongly, and it is often drawn to those areas. I can feel the negative emotions of people around me, and I would always stay clear of large areas of it. I figured if I could feel so much of it in one place, that was somewhere I should avoid. Hashirama recalled his astonishment. The Kyuubi can feel human emotions? He was truly surprised when Naruko looked up and glared at him. That was so unusual for him away from the battlefield. Why shouldn't he? A dog has intelligence and emotions, and the Biju aren't just simple animals. For all that the fox and the others are called demons, I've met humans more cruel and hateful than any of them. He was aware that she referred to the fox as he. Although it was generally believed that the Biju were genderless, people typically use a male pronoun when they aren't called it. The familiarity in her tone was what drew his attention. He pressed, sensing a possible lead. Explain to me then, how you excuse the Kyuubi's attacks on villages. Not just clan settlements, but civilian villages. Villages like the one you grew up in, he continued pointedly, have been attacked by him, and in some cases wiped out without cause. I would think that you, of all people, would hate him. Naruko stopped talking and looked away. She swallowed, and he heard it. Since he was genuinely interested in her opinion and the way she would present her case, he gave her time to collect her thoughts. Her voice was rough and thick with emotion when she finally spoke. All he has experienced for years is anger and hate, pain and loneliness. Every negative emotion a person can experience multiplied by thousands. The fox has lived his entire life decades and centuries always being perceived by everyone he has encountered as a monster, a demon, or a tool to use or destroy. I feel what the fox feels, and it's all of that, but amplified. I've been alone, and the pain I felt, everyone's hate directed at me, would have driven me insane. The only reason I didn't become so full of hate and anger that I lashed out and attacked them was because of the Ichirakus and Iruka. The trail of her tears glistened as they ran freely down her face, her eyes squeezed shut, in the lingering light from the windows. Naruko stopped and rubbed her eyes wildly. She tried to relax and regain her composure by taking slow, trembling breaths. Hashirama was forced to fight back tears and take deep breaths. Her voice was steadier when she spoke again. I know you and Tobirama are curious about why I don't hate humanity, why I'm not out getting revenge on the village I grew up in. The difference between me and the fox is I had people step in to save me, to show me the light, to show me happiness, in a world that had only shown me pain and darkness. And I grabbed that light with both hands and have refused to let it go. The Kyuubi isn't a creature made up of hate. He has been driven mad by the hate of humanity that fills this world like a poison in a never-ending cycle. He has been surrounded by it for so long that hate is all he can feel. Whispering, "It sounds like you want to help him," Hashirama said. With her body stretched out from its curled position, Naruko leaned back against the wall and relaxed. Picking at the threads on her pants, Naruko began, "I do. It's one of the reasons I want the fighting and hate to stop. You know, I've had an idea. The fox is drawn to areas where negative emotions have gathered and are the strongest, and that's where he causes the most damage. I feel like he's not trying to cause more but." Hashirama concluded, "Destroy what he feels is a source of hate." "Yeah," said Naruko. Because of her emotional turmoil, her voice was rougher and more husky than before. "I think he's trying to get rid of some of the hate that's overwhelming him, but instead he's only causing more." Naruko fell into silence without saying anything more. Hashirama also remained silent as he tried to make sense of everything he had learned, and his mind was racing with new insights. He was making a move primarily for her benefit, but he also had an idea that would further win her over to his clan, something he detested to admit. He yelled, "Naruko," and waited to get her attention. He rose from the chair and sat down on the floor in front of her as soon as their eyes locked. "I will make this promise to you, that if any member of my clan comes across the fox, that they will leave him be, they won't try to cause him harm. If we ever get word of another clan trying to find him to use him, I will personally get involved to make sure he remains free." Naruko began crying once more halfway through his oath, and by the end, she threw herself at him. Having read her body language, Hashirama wasn't surprised by her action, but he was taken aback by her confidence in him enough to embrace him despite the fact that he was a complete stranger. Even though he was surprised, he responded by holding her closer as he heard her murmuring repeatedly against his shoulder, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Hashirama knew that the sensation of the Kyuubi's chakra igniting inside her and gently radiating warmth throughout her body was real because he was this close to her. He questioned whether the fox's chakra possessed any kind of consciousness. Its reaction could only be explained by it. Her explanations to Tobirama were consistent with flare-ups during periods of high emotion. However, the chakra was reacting more than what was deemed a flare. The fox was last seen fighting with some of the local clans in Kumo, according to credible and verified reports. Naruko could be consumed and taken over by the chakra, which would make him even more dangerous if it were true that the chakra had sentience when it was separated from its source. They remained a very real threat, regardless of any new information he had learned about the Biju. To be honest, he had no idea that would be risky with her. He had previously sensed the fox's chakra, and although it was undoubtedly the Kyuubi's chakra, it felt somehow lighter, less spiteful and hateful. He had some theories about that, but he also couldn't believe that people all over the world didn't even hear a hint of her existence. Whether she was traveling constantly or not, concealing her skills or not, she was a memorable figure, and both shinobi and civilians could gossip about her like no one else. She should have become well known. He would almost believe she was a ghost if he and his brother weren't in the circumstances they were in, seeing, touching, and conversing with her. He sent out feelers to his clan's contacts across the nation, asking them to inquire about a young blonde girl with whisker marks who might have passed through a village, while he was away from Tobirama watching her. Up until the day he departed to replace Tobirama, he had received responses stating that no one had ever seen or heard of her. That amounted to nearly 10 villages that were well-known stops along the most traveled roads but were unaware of her. She could have worn a henge in populated areas, of course. It would make sense with a face as familiar as hers. She could be found and apprehended if she established herself as a known entity and left a trail. She pulled back sheepishly as Naruto calmed down, jolting him out of his reverie. Her voice was hoarse as she said, "I'm so sorry, I don't normally hug complete strangers and cry on them." She sat on her knees in front of him and pulled away from him completely. He was startled when she inhaled deeply and then slapped her cheeks. He attempted to take her hands, quickly considered his options, and then proceeded. With a soft smile, he drew them away from her face. "I think, after you crying all over me, we can officially say we are no longer strangers, right?" With a smile of her own, Naruto's cheeks began to flush. "Right." Hashirama rolled to his feet and released one of her hands. Naruto, using the hand he still held, followed his example. "I'll get some food started, have an early dinner. I'd say we can put off any further talk for a few hours, This response was interrupted by a deep, rumbling growl. Arms clamping down over his stomach, Naruto flushed. Naruto's face turned a deeper shade of red as Hashirama laughed, a full, throated belly laugh. "I'll get some food started, then." When Naruto's heel struck his ribs, Hashirama let out a grunt, but she whirled away from him before he could strike back. Thankfully, his speed was sufficient and not slow, unlike Tobirama. Even when confined to taijutsu, Hashirama had to focus entirely on Naruto. She had been urging him to spar with her this morning. He had agreed because Tobirama's notes had stated that she had amazing endurance and that he could imagine her getting tired from living on the road. Now that he knew what Tobirama meant by her taijutsu, he relished the challenge she presented. He saw that she had a rhythm to her style, but it was hard to get past her defenses or counter because of how unpredictable it was. However, it was not impossible. She rolled with her momentum and jumped back to her feet after he struck her shoulder, sending her to the ground. He was winning their spar because of his height, weight, and inherent physical strength, which was greater than hers. Finally, he managed to get her down long enough to pin her, kneeling on top of her, pinning her arm and the remainder of his weight on top of her. He was getting her down and landing more hits than she was. She gave him a sigh and shifted in the little room she had to reduce his weight. "Ow, get off, you're heavy," she said. He shifted so that even more of his weight was pinning her, smiling at the whooshing sound as he knocked the breath out of her lungs. "Heavy? I'm barely putting any weight on you," he said, a little offended. She let out a wheeze and used her free hand to bat futilely at his thigh. After torturing her for a few more minutes, he finally moved his weight away from her and sat down in the grass next to her gasping body. Instead of getting up, Naruto quickly slowed her breathing and relaxed in the grass and sunlight. Her endurance and healing appeared to be comparable to, if not superior to, his. Given her current abilities, she could easily compete with him, Tobirama, and Madara in combat if given the right training. After several minutes of silence, he asked, "You good?" Her only response was a slight nod, and she hummed. She was simply enjoying the warmth of the sun. There was no other way to characterize her actions. When she showed no sign of moving, he took a seat in the grass. Later, when he sensed nature chakra swirling around them, he had to physically restrain himself. To find out what he was feeling, he remained motionless and regulated his breathing, entering a state of mild meditation. Naruto was not absorbing any of the chakra or even displaying any symptoms that she could sense it, despite the fact that it was swirling in the air around them. Hashirama turned off his senses and returned his attention to Naruto. Either she had received some training to become a sage, or it was a consequence of the fox's chakra, because the nature chakra was responding to her. He had sensed nature chakra after one of the Biju's outbursts, and the Biju were composed of chakra. It would make sense if she could use senjutsu by controlling some of it. Although it was largely conjecture, the second theory seemed the most likely because sages were uncommon and those with the chakra capacity to become sages were even more so. It was something to share with Tobirama, as well as his pre-return findings. He had looked everywhere within 5 miles of where they found her, but he had found nothing. After a thorough search, he believed he had sensed something in a small meadow, but nothing had turned up. To allow Tobirama to conduct his own search, he had left a note. The fact that there were no traces of the alleged altercation that left her exhausted, unconscious, and injured raised suspicions. They discovered her in an area devoid of any damaged trees and no bodies. Since they sensed the Kyuubi's chakra surge almost exactly where they found her, it should have been nearby. Since she would have been a beacon to any respectable shinobi in the vicinity, she could not have approached under its control. No, it was just a single chakra surge followed by nothing. And for a battle to deplete her energy, it would have been destructive and time-consuming. It caused a significant gap in her narrative. One could not afford to overlook a missing battleground. He had to consider the possibility that Naruko was a plant, even though he didn't want to think the worst of her because she was sincere and kind. She might have been discovered by the Yamanaka or Uchiha clans, who could have changed her memories and thoughts, leading her to believe the tale she told them. They had a neutral relationship with the Yamanaka, but unlike the Uzumaki, they don't have any close ties that would ensure their loyalty or inaction. Missions determine financial gain, and as long as clans are kept apart, they are competitors. The Uchiha were oddly silent, but there was no worrying activity in the surrounding clans that suggested any sort of attack preparation. Not always a good thing, as the last time he saw Madara, the man was carrying his injured brother away after being hit by Tobirama. Madara's silence was concerning because word had leaked out that Izuna had died from his injuries. Keeping Izuna alive and safe had been his old friend's obsession. With his brother still alive, Madara had been largely sensible. He was fierce in combat but cool-headed. Now that his old friend's anchor was gone, he was anxious about what he would do. Until Mito came to examine Naruko, he was adamant that she not be exposed to any harmful information. He could feel less anxious about her because she had seals that could detect any changes made to her. He wouldn't have to worry about putting her down if she passed away. He was startled out of his reverie by a tiny tearing sound and blinked. As he thought about what he didn't want to do but might have to do, he noticed that his hands had responded to his thoughts by tearing up blades of grass. If he didn't know any better, he would assume that Naruko had fallen asleep when he looked up at her. He smiled with childish delight and threw a handful of grass in her face, pushing his sinister thoughts to another moment. In order to prevent any stray blades, Naruko carefully opened one eye while scrunching her face up. She gave him a savage glare after puffing out a breath to get some of them off her face. He didn't take her seriously because she had the same twinkle of mischievousness in her eyes that he frequently saw in his own. "Really?" she interrogated. "How old are you supposed to be?" Grinning, he rolled to his feet with ease and tossed another handful of grass at her. "I'm 23, I'll have you know." After wiping the grass from her face, Naruko got to her feet. "Really? God, you're old." He sagged to the floor and moaned. Naruko's smile was short-lived, and her hands flitted tensely about him. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm sore, oomph." Hashirama quickly started another round of sparring after he snapped out of it and tackled her to the ground. Naruko pushed him away and slid into a stance while hurling taunts at him. Hashirama concealed his thoughts by maintaining a smile. He had one more day to spend with her alone before Mito arrived and the last tests were completed tomorrow. Naruko's story had too many gaps, but he didn't want to kill her or put her in jail. He would do whatever it took to keep his clan safe, even if it meant hardening his heart against her and recalling what she had told him about the fox yesterday. For the past week, Naruko has been more anxious and bored than she had ever been. She has never had to be mindful of her words at all times, nor has she ever had to combine the truth and lies to the point where she was unaware of what she had said. She will be among the first to acknowledge that she was viewed as being too honest and sentimental for her line of work. She had never been good at lying, and she had always been sensitive to everything. She has always been outspoken, and she usually succeeds as a result. Kurama would give her the equivalent of a mental smack or yell at her whenever the guilt became unbearable, which was the only reason she hadn't collapsed into a pool of guilt and told Hashirama the truth. Lying annoyed her, especially to someone as kind as Hashirama had proven to be. Her primary source of anxiety over the past few days has also been the only highlight for her. Mito Uzumaki, the first Hokage's wife, Kurama's first Jinchuriki, was also a living member of the Uzumaki clan, which was crucial, and getting there with Tobirama in less than an hour. Growing up, Naruko had never really thought about her name. Sarutobi. Gigi had the same response when she asked about her parents as when she asked about her name. All of her relatives had passed away. That was over. She had assumed her family was just another ordinary, unremarkable shinobi family and had never been interested in finding out more about the origin of her name. The Uzumaki clan had most likely been mentioned in the history classes she knew had been taught in the academy, but she had never gone and was now deeply regretting not going. She intended to apologize to Iruka if she returned. Hell, if she apologized for missing school, his head would most likely blow up. But it was more than just meeting another Uzumaki that made her anxious. Kurama had informed her that their best chance was for Mito to listen to them, as there was no way to conceal the actual significance of both seals from a seal master. Naruko wanted to think the best of them, but she was still a stranger who showed up during a time of war, even if she didn't tell the others. She would need to rely on the time travel theory to escape any difficult circumstances, at the very least. She would have someone else who could demonstrate that she was from the future, even if she lost their trust today. According to Tobirama's early morning message, Mito and a few other Uzumaki had arrived. Damn it, Tobirama wanted to be able to use her clones once more, and she had left a shadow clone. And met Mito outside the compound of the clan. It would be better if fewer people were aware that Mito had arrived without warning or a clear explanation. There were spies everywhere, Hashirama had told her, and he knew that his and Tobirama's behavior over the past week had to attract some notice. Although scouts for other clans were constantly on the outskirts of their borders, he had no doubts about the loyalty of his clanmates. Anyone with eyes would notice what the Senju clan leaders were doing. First, they both depart abruptly, followed by Hashirama's solo return and subsequent departure a few days later. After that, Tobirama appears. A group from the Uzumaki clan shows up with the clan heiress, and they both depart without Hashirama coming back. Others would quickly realize what Hashirama and Tobirama had discovered and begin to look into it. According to Hashirama, Tobirama and Mito would have to take every possible precaution to avoid being noticed or followed. Although the precautions he and Tobirama had taken to keep her hidden by leaving and coming here, they would not take any chances and would prefer that as few people as possible knew about her at this time. If someone attempted to follow them, they would make false trails, and they would only show up as night fell. She reached this point as a result. It was dull to wait. Naruko let out another sigh. She couldn't remember how many she'd done. With her arms thrown wherever they pleased, she crossed her ankles and collapsed onto her back on the futon. With a louder and more dramatic sigh than she had let out all day, Hashirama shifted against the wall by her head. I guess my company's that bad, huh? She was a mixture of amused and frustrated because he had only done this a few times in the last few days. She apologized profusely to everyone if she had been anything like this, at this point. But now she just stared at him, wondering if she should try to outsigh him. She shrugged and did not sigh, enjoying the fact that she was the grown-up for once. At least we'll no longer be bored, and if she clears me I can finally leave this place, right? He smiled at her and nodded. Looking at him, she cocked her head back. So, what would happen after, if I'm cleared to go? Hashirama scowled. Best case scenario, you are fully cleared, Mito confirms the chakra is no threat to you or us, and you come back to our clan for a probationary period. Once the probationary period is cleared you can be integrated into the clan. Naruko gave a nod. And worst case? I want the truth, please. Hashirama drew a deep breath and asked, worst case? There are a few possibilities depending on what Mito finds. Knowing she had to pay close attention to what he was going to say next, Naruko sat up and turned to sit back on the wall next to him. Hashirama stared into the rest of the cabin instead of at her. If she finds evidence of mental coercion from another clan pushing you to get close to us to gather information or take us out, and it's not reversible, we would have no choice but to take you out. Trust him, Kurama continued. They will kill you without hesitation, regardless of how kind they appear to be or how attached you are to them. Since shinobi were bred to be killers, we are living through the most brutal time in their history. You were born into a peaceful world and have never killed anyone. They're not going to hold back. Naruko responded to both of them with a slow nod. And if they are reversible? We would reverse it as best we can. Your probationary period would be a lot longer of course, but if you prove you're trustworthy, you would eventually be integrated in the clan, he stated. Naruko was genuinely at a loss for words for a change. The rest of the time was spent in tense silence, punctuated only by awkward questions. Hashirama rekindled the fire, but neither of them felt particularly hungry. As the sun began to set, they sat at the table and anxiously watched the door. As they waited for the sun to set and Mito to arrive, Hashirama was tapping his fingers on the tabletop and Naruko's leg was bouncing. When they both felt Tobirama's chakra flare twice, pause, and then flare again, the sun had just set. Although Naruko was unaware of the significance of the timed flares, he assumed they were a sign that they were not being pursued. To signal to Tobirama that it was safe for him to enter, Hashirama flared his own chakra twice and felt them both land outside. Naruko followed Hashirama as he got up from the table. She was waiting for them to enter while wringing her hands. Tobirama entered without knocking, holding the door open for Mito behind him. Tobirama's gaze instantly locked with hers. She couldn't read anything in his eyes, but before she could figure it out, he turned to face Hashirama. After a few sharp looks at Hashirama, Tobirama turned back to her, and the corner of his mouth raised in a gesture that would have been more comforting if it had reached his eyes. The next figure in the door made Tobirama's heart race as she went to stand by his brother. There was no photograph of Mito Uzumaki that Naruko had ever seen. Hair clips held her bankshis to the side, and her signature red hair, which Naruko still wished she had, was in 2 buns with pins in them. Like Sakura, Shan and Tsunade. Bachan, she had a mark on her forehead and brown eyes. With a single glance, Naruko could tell that Mito could kick her ass in her plain green kimono with a blue obi if she so desired. Mito was evaluating her in the same way that Naruko was, but Naruko was unable to read anything in her face or eyes. A minute later, Mito entered the cabin completely and closed the door, leaving only the fire and the light that remained from the outside. When Mito's smile reached her eyes, Naruko relaxed a little and returned the shy smile. Mito pointed toward the table. She waited until Naruko took a seat before pulling the other chair over to her so that the table was out of the way. "Let's have a seat." Tobirama remained back against the wall, as did Hashirama. "No doubt you already know, but to have some form of decent human interaction, my name is Uzumaki Mito." Naruko smiled once more. "Namikaze Naruko." Mito extended her hand, palm facing up. She clarified at Naruko's perplexed expression. "I'm going to do a brief scan of you with my chakra. If there are any seals on your body, this will let me find them even if they can't be seen." Naruko paled slightly and her eyes grew wide. Here, in front of everyone, she would discover Kurama's seal and the time travel seal. Even though she had known Mito would discover almost everything, she asked all the kami she could think of to allow her to explain without them being present. Slowly, Naruko put her left hand in Mito's. Naruko concealed a wince, but Mito maintained a soothing smile despite her hesitation, as evidenced by the subtle sharpening of her eyes. He sensed Mito gathering her chakra as she gently closed her other hand over Naruko's. As Mito's chakra scanned Naruko's body, there was utter silence for a minute. When Mito scowled and her eyes widened, Naruko firmly prevented herself from turning to face either Tobirama or Hashirama. Naruko begged for privacy as best she could with her eyes as her eyes narrowed and snapped up to her. Before speaking to the others, Mito gazed at her for a good minute. "I found 2 seals on her, but to see them she needs to take her shirt off." With a nod, Hashirama took hold of Tobirama's elbow and pulled him outside. "Call us when you're done." As soon as the door closed behind Hashirama and Tobirama, Naruko exhaled in relief. Mito took notice and squinted once more. She commanded, "I sent them out, now show me the seals." In compliance, Naruko removed her shirt but left her bra on. Kurama's seal appeared on her stomach as she collected the small amount of chakra she could access. Mito took a deep breath and began muttering to herself while her eyes darted wildly over the seal. The occasional phrase was picked up by Naruko. She muttered to herself, "Not the original. Been opened. And change. Must be willing, but how?" Her eyes flashed up to hers without pupils. "You need to explain why you have a seal that is containing the actual Kyuubi when I know that the beast is currently enlightening." Naruko nodded, in awe of Mito's ability to learn so much from a few minutes of studying the seal. "Naruko," asked Kurama. Fortunately, she hadn't been silent for very long because Mito was still standing across from her, calm but serious. She and Kurama had discussed how to get Mito to listen to them, but Naruko felt compelled to speak first. "All I ask is that you stay calm." Mito nodded despite her eyes narrowing even more. As Kurama advanced, Naruko inhaled, closed her eyes, and allowed a portion of her thoughts to return. When she opened her eyes again, only one of them was red after Kurama pulled on her mind. Every time Mito slept, they had been discussing how they could persuade her of the truth. Knowing that if he presented himself alone, she might attack, Kurama had thought of this. In addition to demonstrating to Mito that they were cooperating, Kurama could use her chakra to conceal his presence from Tobirama and Hashirama. Kurama came up with the idea of Sage Mode, which had to be used very quickly and strategically to prevent Hashirama from noticing. The confusing sensation of having control over her body but not having control over it was the only thing she hadn't anticipated. In their minds, she and Kurama were attempting to strike a suitable balance. Eventually, she allowed him to take over her body, and they would switch off who spoke. When her eyes opened, Mito gasped and jerked back, reaching for a symbol on her sleeve, but Kurama grabbed her arm instead. Disorientation pushed to the back of her mind, Naruko spoke. Observing her body move without actively doing so was strange. "This is why I asked you, so stay calm. It's a very unbelievable story that we have, but we need you to believe us." "Us?" she inquired cautiously. Naruko gave Kurama the opportunity to speak. The deep voice, which seemed to be speaking in her head, caused Mito's arm to jerk in surprise. Naruko's lips did not move, but the voice was audible. "Us. I am the Kyuubi and Naruko Uzumaki Namikaze is my host. Or Jinchuriki as it will come to be called." Kurama released her after Mito gave her arm a gentle tug. "How is that possible?" Last reports, you were somewhere in lightning. And where did that seal come from? Its base is Uzumaki style, but it is incredibly complex, like nothing I've ever seen. His tone was warning. Everything I am going to tell you is the truth, and is spoken in the strictest confidence. Yes, I am in lightning, but I am eventually sealed into a host. Naruko is the third to hold me. Eventually? Mito inquired, his eyes widening. That's impossible. Before now, didn't you believe it was impossible for a human to contain a Biju? It had never been done before Kyuubi was sealed the first time, and you don't really know anything about what they are capable of, Naruko continued. She respected Kurama's request that she keep his name a secret. Kurama clarified, though it is not by my doing that we are here. We are not from this time, as you have guessed. We were forcibly sent here during a war around 100 years from now. We will not tell you any details, no names and no dates. If you need proof, look at the seal on her back. Mito stood up and walked around her, taking a cautious look at her body. Via Kurama, Naruko sensed the slight pressure of Mito's nail as it traced the seal on her shoulder. She returned to her seat after perhaps 10 minutes of analysis. Mito stared at her fingers, interlacing them in front of her face, and was silent for a while. Since Kurama was in control, her body remained motionless and none of her anxious tics appeared. After a while, she spoke. I would think you were crazy if not for that seal. It is blatantly obvious for anyone that has enough knowledge of seals and time. Space Jutsu. And I know who created it, his chakra left a signature in the seal. She raised her hand prior to them saying anything. I will not ask how he is still alive or the circumstances surrounding how you got here. Do not say any names or give too many details about anything you know of the past, we don't know what will happen. Mito indicated the shoulder that the seal was attached to. The seal is similar to something Tobirama is almost done working on, actually. It created a rip through time and space, using his chakra as an anchor. Mito clarified. I suspected as much, but wasn't sure. I'll need to dumb it down for her a little bit, Kurama stated. Getting the information in is the hardest part, but once she has it she can understand and manipulate it pretty well. Both Kurama's statement and Mito's simplistic explanation caused Naruko to furrow her brows. She asked him out loud, did you just insult me and compliment me in the same sentence? Kurama did not respond to that query. Remember I told you your father improved on Tobirama's technique when it came to his Hiraishin? That's what she's talking about. The reason your father was so fast was because the seals he used literally ripped through this dimension and teleported him to where the seal was. Understand that much. Naruko understood why Kurama was telling her this out loud because she knew Mito was observing her body intently with both of them. He was giving Mito an opportunity to observe that they collaborated willingly. She replayed everything Kurama said in her mind while concentrating on his explanation. Did her father's jutsu, which was essentially Tobirama's, focus on time and space seals, making them so swift, imply that it was comparable to Kakashi's Kamui? She questioned Kurama about it. He sounded a little surprised at how effortlessly she was grabbing seals, but he said, yes, actually. That jutsu opens up a hole to another dimension entirely. What your father and Senju did was basically the same thing but much faster, almost instantaneous. And instead of another dimension, it just moved them through ours at high speeds. That makes sense. I remember Arrow Senin talking about Tusen's Hiraishin and that he had special kunai with seals on them tossed across battlefields. So what he was doing was hopping through our dimension to the location of each seal, using the seals as a focus. She sought clarification. Yes, that's it exactly. Now remember what he used to create the seal on your back. Kurama responded. With a little encouragement, he hoped Naruko would be able to deduce Madara's actions on her own. Naruko nodded and said, his chakra. So, I get that the seal he must have used was doing the same thing as Hiraishin, but altered so it ripped through time, right? But it still would have needed a focus, something to anchor us so we didn't just go to a random time. Naruko went silent for a moment before realizing what she was saying. She would have punched her hand if she had been in control of her body. He used his chakra to create the seal and used his chakra that's in this time as the focus to send us to. That's what happened, right? Kurama nodded, and even Mito appeared somewhat impressed by her ability to figure out the seal's operation with minimal guidance and no prior knowledge of seals beyond the rudiments. She had a natural talent for sealing and it was in her blood. Do you know how long we'll be here? I've figured out that the seal acts as a timer but am unsure how to judge human chakra capacities, Kurama said, swallowing his pride for the sake of both Naruko and himself. Mito gave a headshake. His chakra is already enormous at this time and there's no telling what he's done to himself in the future that could affect the rate it is used. I was able to find out that the seal hasn't activated yet. It won't until it comes in range of his chakra. Mito stopped and asked, "Why did you tell me the truth?" The implications of what Kurama had called her sailed over Naruko's head, but Mito's eyes widened. The kid here is horrible at telling lies. The Senju will know the truth soon, and it will be easier to believe if we can actually explain what happened to us and have you confirm our story. And a little help backing our current story for those who can't know, Naruko said. Sharing her body and having to switch back and forth so they could both talk was really uncomfortable, and she really wanted to end this conversation. Kurama recoiled as he sensed her thoughts, both of her eyes returning to Blue Mito's signal that he was finished for the time being. "All right, I'll help. Tobirama told me what he knew and suspected about you," said Mito. Naruko gave a nod. Because of the animosity at the time, Kurama had told her that they would all tell each other anything they discovered about her. "They suspect that either your mother or father was an Uzumaki due to your chakra." "My mother was," stated Naruko. She grabbed her shirt and put it back on because she felt a little strange sitting in her bra. In any case, Mito didn't have to gaze at her seals anymore. Leaning forward, Mito pondered. "We won't be able to identify them, but you are unquestionably an Uzumaki. I can say with confidence that you are, in fact, securely holding the Kyuubi's chakra and that there are no dangers on that end. Since you told them your parents died when you were born a Euro." She paused, and Naruko nodded, confirming that statement. Naruko recalled something. "Tobirama saw the seal on my back." "Yes," she said with a nod. "He told me, since the actual seal is on your stomach they don't know about it. We can say that one is what's holding the chakra as long as they don't know. There are also no indications that your mind may have been tampered with and that you're a spy. Once I give you the all clear, they will both let you out of here. I'll say the seal on your back is from an attempt to take control of you to steal the power, but it's incomplete, while the other one is what contains it within you. The one on your back made the chakra unstable, but I removed it." Mito concentrated a portion of her chakra and then dispelled it swiftly. "What was that for?" wanted to know Naruko. Mito leaned back in her chair and said, "So Hashirama and Tobirama will believe I did something about a seal." She felt more at ease around Naruko now that she knew she could be trusted and that she would eventually join her clan. "You could come back to the Uzushiogakure with me if you want. I can make a case about securing the seal and they'll let you come." Naruko felt conflicted. She was desperate to see her heritage and meet her ancestors. She had the opportunity to witness it in all its splendor, rather than the ruin it must have been during her lifetime. In order to understand what the hell was going on in the past, she simultaneously needed and wanted to remain close to Tobirama and Hashirama. "Kurama. I would continue to support the Senju. They are essential to the major historical events, but we will be here for a while, so there will be time to witness it. It's better to be close to them, understand what's happening, and know precisely when we were there." When Tobirama and Hashirama rushed through the door, she was about to respond, disappointed but understanding. She and Mito both leapt to their feet, their faces urgent. Tobirama talked rapidly. "I left a clone with the clan and it dispelled to give me an update. The Uchiha, Madara in the lead, are mobilizing and headed our way. You two stay here," said Hashirama. He was looking at Naruko with a very serious expression that brought back memories of his initial questioning of her. "Mito will guard you here. We cannot let Madara get his hands on you. Tobirama and I are going to confront him with our forces and we'll send for you both when it's over." Mito held onto her wrist, preventing Naruko from grumbling. Concerned by the somber looks on their faces, she wanted to go and assist. Although they appeared uncertain based on the expression in their eyes, they were speaking as though they would return. Both Mito and she nodded. Mito released her and approached Hashirama. Tobirama caught Naruko's attention as she turned her head away to give them some space. Both of them ended up staring at each other after he had turned his head away from them as well. With a sudden sense of resolve, she strode towards him. "I don't know what the hell has you both so worried," she muttered angrily, "but stay alive." Naruko wondered what the devil had become of her, since she was essentially telling a practical stranger a Euro, the future Nadaime, at that a Euro, to stick around in a battle against Madara Uchiha, even though she knew he wouldn't die until the Second War. Yes, she had some historical knowledge. Only a few, mind you, and what she did know was what she had studied about the Hokage in the academy. She didn't listen to any other history lectures. Despite the burning sensation in her ears, Naruko maintained eye contact. In any case, she wasn't supposed to be aware of Tobirama's death, and it was common to worry when friends were leaving for combat. We may not have known each other long, but I'd like to think of you as my friend and I don't want to lose a friend. Tobirama gave a brief but sincere smile as she nodded. He reached up and touched her arm with a warm hand. Stay with Mito. I'll do all I can, but if something does go wrong, go with her to Uzushiogakure. You'll be safe there. She took the hand on her arm in her own, squeezed it lightly, and released it. I promise, and I always keep my word. They concluded their conversation at the same time as Mito and Hashirama. Hashirama and Naruto exchanged warm but anxious smiles as Naruto nodded at her. Mito approached Tobirama and touched her face. He dutifully bent over, and Mito planted a kiss on his cheek. When Tobirama straightened up and finally looked into Naruto's eyes before turning to go with Hashirama, he gave her a gentle smile. After the door shut behind them, Naruto began to pace. Mito observed her with interest. What's wrong? Naruto growled. I hate sitting on the sidelines. I'm not the kind of person that sits by as other people fight, I want to go with them. But you can't, said Mito coolly. But I can't, she repeated, pausing and lowering her shoulders. Her face was contorted by a number of emotions, the most noticeable of which were anger, helplessness, and fear. I know they won't die. Not for a while, Naruto said, missing Mito's shoulders as she relaxed and slipped, but that doesn't mean I want to just leave them. Naruto, Mito said, holding her shoulder tenderly. If you interfere. That's just it, Mito. Naruto turned to the older woman and said in desperation. I've gone over everything I remember from my history classes and there's not even a mention of someone like me. Kyuubi didn't know this would happen to me and he's here in this time. Mito's gaze expanded. There's nothing. Mito inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly when she angrily shook her head. If you're here, sent back by him of all people, you must have made an impact on the past. There's no reason your actions or existence wouldn't be recorded unless you asked them not to be. Naruto began to pace once more while muttering a growl. I hate this. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, what I can say and not say, what I can interfere with that won't change anything, or what I did in the first place that the Madara where I'm from remembers. Damn it, time travel is so confusing. She threw herself to the futon on the floor and leaned back against the wall after she had finished her tirade. After a minute, Mito joined her. I don't know. Can't begin to imagine what you're going through right now and I don't know what to say to try and help you. With her arms wrapped around her legs, Naruto brought her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them. Time travel sucks. Mito bumped her shoulder against Naruto's and grinned without humor. It seems to. Naruto mumbled a growl to herself. I get that I'm stuck here until this seal time's out, but I left during a major fight in a war. All my friends are back there alone, fighting, until I go back. I've come to like Tobirama and Hashirama, and even knowing they don't die, I want to be out there watching their backs. With nothing recorded, I could have been with them in this fight, and any others that may come. With a sense of helplessness, Mito gazed at the younger girl, unsure of how to console her. After a while, she simply put her shoulder to hers and offered silent encouragement. I wouldn't worry too much about Tobirama and Hashirama. They're some of the best shinobi out there. After removing her head from her arms, Naruto looked her in the eyes. Her eyes were full of intense, probing light. You believe that, but you're also worried for them. They're worried too. Why? What's so different about this fight against Madara? Isn't it kinda a regular thing, going to fight against him? Mito sighed and turned away. It's the first time Madara has been seen since his brother, Izuna, was killed by Tobirama. Izuna was Madara's last brother and his anchor, for lack of a better word. Naruto wanted to know what made Madara the man she knew, so she inquired, Anchor how? Well, you know how Uchiha are predisposed to insanity. That insanity comes from the loss of love. Naruto gestured with her hands. Wait. A loss of love. Mito smiled sadly as she nodded. Not many know this, but the Uchiha control their emotions so much because they feel so strongly compared to most people. When they love with all that they are. They protect that love, and the light it brings fiercely. If they lose that love, that light, their own negative emotions overwhelm them and they become driven by senseless hate, a need for revenge that is never satisfied. Naruto grimaced and rubbed her chest. I've experienced their hate, but how does this connect to Madara and the fight? Mito wondered about the motion and eyed it curiously, but he kept moving forward. All of Madara's brothers were killed when he was young. All but Izuna, and Madara has protected his younger brother viscously in the past. In the last battle, Tobirama fatally wounded him, and a few days later word spread that he had died and Madara had vanished after leaving orders for his clan. Izuna was all the Madara had, and everyone, even enemies, knew how much he cared for him. Naruko's eyes widened as she finally understood. Madara's hatred overcame him in the absence of Izuna serving as his compass and heart. Madara had his brother's eyes, so Naruko knew he possessed the eternal Mangekyo. He must have been learning how to use it during his absence, because he returned and battled the Senju clan, driven by his grief and hatred for his younger brother's passing. And Tobirama killed him. It was only because Kurama abruptly took control of Naruko's legs that she wasn't leaping to her feet to run after them. Rather than jumping to her feet, her upper body spread out over the floor, and her legs stayed bent. When Mito saw the single red eye, she jumped in shock and reached for the seal on her sleeve. When she realized what had happened, she forced herself to relax. "Slow down, you fool." In her mind, Kurama snapped. "You acknowledge that you are aware that they do not die." This battle marked the beginning of the village's development and brought the Uchiha and Senju together. With a pout, Naruko took a seat, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Yes, when she realized what everyone was so concerned about, she had briefly forgotten that they had a few more years to live. This was one thing she decided not to get involved in, despite her frustration with what to do and what not to do. "Sorry about that," she said to Mito while Kurama released her knees. She was annoyed at Kurama's ease of taking charge, but she wasn't going to put him in a cage or shut him out any longer. It would save time if he could take charge and take action instead of asking, since he frequently saw things before she did. She would need his assistance given their circumstances. Mito gave a feeble laugh. "I completely understand. The only reason I'm so calm right now is because you let slip that they lived." Naruko pondered how Madara managed to keep his darkness and hatred under control long enough to establish the village. She was aware that he stayed long enough for some of the other nations to begin establishing their own villages, but she was unaware of the length of time it took to become a recognized shinobi village. When two separate chakras flared and grew, distant echoing sounds of explosions reached them even where they were, causing both Naruko's resolve and Mito's composure to falter. In an attempt to relax, the two women instinctively reached for each other's hands. Madara's shoulder throbbed and flared at the touch of her chakra, and she hissed as she clutched the shoulder the seal was on with her free hand. The older woman pulled her shirt away from her back to look at the seal, and Mito was right there. After a moment of reflection, Mito said, "It's activated, but there's nothing to tell how long you'll be here. We'll have to think of something to explain a way for you to contain the fox's chakra. Hashirama will want to look at the seal and he'll recognize that that's not the purpose of this. I can layer seals around this to hide it from sight and create a fake one possible of containing the fox's chakra for them to see if they ask." Before the throb subsided to a slight ache, Naruko grunted, feeling the chakra in the seal synchronize with her own. "Fine with me." She didn't know what it did. Kyuubi hid the seal I arrived in a layer of his chakra and senjutsu, like a genjutsu. "If we get a free moment alone, would it help you to see it?" After giving her a nod, Mito grabbed her arm and lifted her sleeve to expose the chakra suppression seal. Mito bit her thumb and said, "There's no reason for you to still have this, so a euro." The seal disappeared after she gave it a quick hand signal, a flare of her chakra, and a single stripe of her blood over it. She nodded gratefully, feeling more at ease now that she could use all of her chakra. They were both leaning back against the wall as comfortably as possible. Hashirama and Madara themselves were strong enough to be felt by non-sensor types from a considerable distance, even though Tobirama and Hashirama had hurried to confront Madara as far away as possible. Their bodies gradually tensed when they heard a faint explosion and felt the ground tremble a little. If they could sense the chakra waves from where they were, Madara wasn't holding anything back now that the battle had started. For self-control, Naruko began repeating the mantra, "They live," repeatedly in her mind. Mito said, "Tell me something, anything, out of the blue." Naruko hurriedly chose the first topic that came to mind that wouldn't reveal anything and said, "Shinobi villages are going to be formed since it's getting ready to happen. Nothing too drastic, as the foundation and initial phases of all the shinobi villages were scheduled to take place within the next year." In fact, Mito's wide eyes turned to face her, and her jaw dropped slightly as her face slackened in shock. "You mean Hashirama does it?" She was aware of what Mito was referring to because she had recently spoken with Hashirama and had learned about his future aspirations. He helps create the village and gives the idea for the other countries to follow, but it was only the first step in a long process. Naruko assumed she would become an expert at being evasive by the end of her stay here, but she had no idea she was capable of it. While she was here, she had to be careful what she said to avoid giving anything away. Indeed, Hashirama brought the clans in Fire Country together to form the village, but tensions between the nations remained high. You said that Tobirama and Hashirama live, does that mean they retreat or they win? Mito asked. As it was happening as they spoke, Naruko didn't bother to avoid a full response. From what I understand, they win, and Hashirama manages to get through to Madara and the clans unite to start forming the village, he said. Mito leaned back against the wall and relaxed a bit more. That's reassuring, if a little hard to believe. Naruko concurred, saying, Uchiha can be stubborn, crazy bastards. Mito burst out laughing. I can see women aren't put under such strict expectations in the future. Naruko tilted her cranium. What do you mean? Mito moved her kimono's folds. Women, even shinobi, are expected to be quiet, demure, and listen to men. We stay at home while the men go out and fight. Uzumaki are always an exception. We're considered hot, blooded and a little crazy. Both women laughed. Even then, women from our clan are kept out of most fights. The only time women really fight is if an enemy gets to the clan's base, then the women defend their home and families. So the mild cursing I just did, very rare. Women aren't expected to talk so crudely, though they are only punished for it depending on the clan. Mito said. Naruko gave a mocking snort. That's definitely not how it is in my time. Of the 5 big shinobi villages that are formed, 2 of them, including mine, are led by women. Some of the scariest and strongest people I know are women. Mito grinned. It's good to know women are considered equals. Happily, Naruko bobbed her head. Yup, a lot of things have changed. No one really wears kimono anymore, though some kunoichi get variations of the style. Body armor like the men wear here is no longer used by anyone but samurai. Mito had a doubtful expression. No armor. Did they not worry about getting killed? Naruko gave a shrug. Of course they do, but the most armor shinobi wear in my time is modified to be lightweight and not as large or bulky. We have flak jackets, arm and leg guards, and mesh armor. There's the random shinobi that wears more traditional armor depending on their abilities, but it's not all that common anymore. Although Mito still had a suspicious appearance, he appeared to believe her. They fell silent again as a distant explosion sounded. The battle raging in the distance had mostly been forgotten, but their firm hold on each other's hands remained unwavering. Why haven't you told Tobirama and Hashirama the truth? Both are smart and talented with seals, they would understand you're from the future. And they've noticed things? Mito asked after a while. Naruko let out a sigh. At first, it was because Kyuubi said this time was hostile and no one trusted outsiders. He didn't know if I would be able to prove it before they killed me. At this point, I want to earn their full trust before I tell them the truth. I just hope they'll understand why I lied. You have multiple forms of proof, and I'll back you. I think they may be upset about the lying, but seeing as we've never experienced a time traveler, I'm pretty confident they won't hold anything against you, said Mito. It wasn't a guarantee, but she was relieved. She hated lying like this, so the main relief came from finally telling someone the whole truth. Naruko was unaware of the amount of time that had gone by. The minutes seemed to pass slowly, but it felt like hours. She regretted not paying more attention in the academy. Perhaps the length of the fight before Madara gave in had been mentioned, but she didn't listen, so she was left in the dark. The fight wouldn't last as long as it could have, she thought. Yes, Madara had the eternal Mangekyo and strength fueled by anger and grief, but no matter who you were, that kind of energy never lasted long. Madara was certain that the fight could easily continue for an entire day if she was in good physical and mental health. However, that was not the case, and she had a suspicion that Madara would burn himself out, shortening the fight. Even from her distance, she sensed Madara's reckless use of his chakra. He was not using the level of chakra control she had seen in her time, but he was cautious enough to continue using his Sharingan. Not weaker, but certainly shorter. Madara remained insanely powerful. This battle would go on for some time. With a whisper, Mito said, "Hey, Naruko." In response, she hummed, and Mito went on. "Are you prepared to face Madara after your experiences with him?" Naruko stopped. Despite all the talk about Madara, she had honestly never considered confronting him face. She couldn't just barge in and attack him or completely ignore him. Those acts would only make her more noticeable to him, if anything. She wasn't ready to confront the man who had put her in this predicament, killed so many people, including her friends, and whose plan to take over the world included murdering her. Any affection she believed she saw in Madara's future must have been a figment of her imagination. He wouldn't have spent years creating a plan that would only work if she died if he truly cared for her, would he? Naruko raged, her fists clenching in response to her thoughts. She has always struggled with self-control and emotional regulation. No amount of mental preparation would help her. She truly had no idea how she would respond to the Madara at this point until she was in his presence. Naruko had an idea, and her hands relaxed. She didn't recognize this Madara. She was obviously powerless to alter him or prevent him from becoming the man she knew, but she wasn't the type to condemn others for deeds they hadn't even done. At the moment, the Madara was just a man who was mourning for his younger brother. She would almost assume Madara was going on a kamikaze rampage if she had to venture a guess. As long as he eliminated Tobirama, Hashirama, and any other senju he could before being eliminated, he might not have intended to survive this battle. She had a mental image of the version she knew, but this was before Madara had changed, and it didn't fit. He was still optimistic at the time, or else he wouldn't have helped establish the village and declared a truce. Both women inhaled deeply as another explosion and a surge of chakra reached them. The wait was going to be long. Inside the senju compound, Naruko waited in the courtyard of Hashirama and Tobirama's private residence. The brothers and Mito had caught up with the Senju clan elders as they drafted their final terms for an alliance with the Uchiha, but she had been ready and dressed for some time. There was a great deal of annoyance and frustration between them all, based on her limited ability to sense emotions. As she waited, she leaned back against the wall and observed the small pond in the courtyard, the languid koi fish swimming in it, and the play of the rising sun's light on the water's surface. She had been thankful for the change of scenery over the past week, but since being taken to the Senju compound, her chakra had needed to be resealed. This seal was intended to conceal her presence from a clan of strong shinobi, not to limit her chakra, because her reserves were too great and she was unable to hide them effectively. She was still prohibited from using jutsu, though. Additionally, she was prohibited from leaving the perimeter of the guest house where she and Mito had been staying as well as the courtyard. Fortunately, because Mito was engaged to Hashirama, they were placed in the guest house that shared a courtyard with the main house rather than in a remote location. However, Tobirama had given her very strict instructions not to leave the compound. The size of the guest house and the fact that she could hear and feel dozens of other people, both shinobi and civilians, surrounding her were the only differences between the two. The rest of the clan couldn't see the courtyard that the main house and guest house shared. It was connected to the main house's grounds, but far enough away that she wouldn't be seen by the clansmen who were rushing through the house with Tobirama and Hashirama. No one would be able to sense her since her chakra was sealed. She had benefited from a proper bath and a means of washing her clothes because she had been stranded in a real house rather than a bare cabin. She hadn't been able to do more than a simple rinse and air dry at the cabin, and she had been running low since Kurama had had to conceal most of her clothing. In the 6 days she had been here, Mito had allowed her to borrow some clothes while her own was drying, but laundry had taken up all 3 hours. The remainder was confined to the courtyard and guest house. No matter how anxious she became, she honestly wasn't looking forward to the day she would finally be permitted to leave. Today, for the first time since she was transported back in time, she would be meeting Madara in person. She had been repeatedly told by Kurama that she couldn't respond badly to him. They wouldn't see any reason for her to fear or hate him because she hadn't been engaged in combat with him during this time. No matter how much he lectured her about it, she knew she couldn't rely on him to keep her composed. He was more impulsive than she was, particularly with Madara. "I've had centuries to develop myself. Control and patience." He glared at her. "You're a baby in comparison to me. I can't have you growling in the back of my mind if I'm supposed to be able to concentrate enough to stick to our story," she yelled. "And don't forget that you can't snap at him." Like a slap on the back of her head, Naruko felt an impression from Kurama. She rolled her shoulders to try to shake the weird sensation and wrinkled her nose. However, she sensed his reluctant agreement and changed the topic. She jumped when she heard a knock on the wall close by, instinctively reaching for her misplaced weapons pouch as she turned. With one hand still up where he had struck the wood, Hashirama was smiling at her. Once again, Naruko was amazed at his strength. He had snuck up on her like it was nothing, not even concealing his massive, dense chakra. He said, "Ready to go." Naruko gave him a sigh. "Ready. I've been stuck waiting for you." She knew it would happen again as soon as she said it. His shoulders slumped and his chin dropped to his chest, and Naruto swore she could see dark clouds over his head. To get them moving, she grabbed his arm and stumbled forward, attempting to drag him along. He arrived in slow steps and muttered that he was sorry she had to wait so long alone. It felt like he was trying to pull a brick wall, and Naruto was jerked to a stop as he stopped in his tracks. Thanks to the sage, he was acting normally again. He pulled her in a different direction by twisting the arm she was holding until he was holding her. This way. You can't be seen yet, remember? Hashirama released her once she was in time with him. She complained but continued, of course I remember. It's why I haven't seen another human face other than Tobirama and Mito in over a week. And why you guys had to wait an extra day after the fight to sneak me here at night. Hashirama grimaced and rubbed the back of his head. Sorry. With the tentative alliance and relocation, along with all the messengers coming and going, security with your situation is hard. Keeping you isolated is the safest thing for you until everything is stable again. Your presence has already made the negotiations harder. Hashirama led Naruto into the forest that surrounded the compound, past the guest house, and she began to weave through trees. How? Hashirama let out a sigh. We're trying to keep you as hidden as possible, so we can't involve another clan like the Nara to act as a neutral party where we can meet and discuss terms. That means we had to agree on a neutral location, but we also had to limit who could come as well. On our side, it's just the two of us and Tobirama, while our cousin Toka stays here since she's third in line to lead the clan. Mito is going by herself without the escorts she came with, for your sake, and as a representative of the Uzumaki clan. Madara knows some about you, and he knows to only bring someone he absolutely trusts along with him since you're one of the main points we're talking about. Since his brother's death, the only person I can think of is Hikaku. He was third in line while Izuna was alive, but he could also be the one to stay behind to watch the clan while Madara brings someone else. Naruto winced. I'm sorry I'm making this so much harder. I know this is what you've wanted for years. Hashirama stopped and turned slightly to smile at her over his shoulder. Don't worry. Things will stabilize, we'll get this village built, and whether you stay with us or go with Mito to Uzushio, hopefully you can grow to call it home. Naruto blinked in surprise. Without hesitation or doubt, he spoke in a soft yet powerful voice. She questioned whether this was what all of her friends meant when they said that people believed in her because of her straightforward confidence in her statements. She could see why Madara was so obsessed with this man and how he brought together several clans to form the village. I already talked to Mito, and while I want to see Uzushio eventually, for now I'd like to stay here with you. Hashirama flashed her white teeth and smiled. Great, we are running a little late though, so we should pick up the pace a little bit. As he jumped up into the trees, Naruto snarled at him and followed. I've been waiting on you. And following you. If we're late it's your fault. As they ran, she could hear his laughter. Every Konoha shinobi knew the rhythm of jumping through the branches like the back of their hand, and Naruto loved to work her muscles. She loved the opportunity to stretch her legs, so she couldn't resist doing some flips and tricks. When Hashirama performed a trick swing and landed on the branch she was aiming for, she nearly stumbled but was able to avoid face planting. Hashirama smiled, a competitive edge curling her lips as her laughter reverberated in her ears. They played in the branches after she jumped after him. They are attempting to trip one another, performing flips and tricks between the branches and generally flaunting themselves. They were attempting to trip each other up and flee at the same time after she flat out tried to push him off a branch. He was much more successful than she was at physically relocating her. Unless she used chakra, attempting to move him was like attempting to move a building. He hardly moved when she attempted to tackle him, instead jumping to the next branch while she clung to his back like a monkey. Clinging to him was extremely awkward because of the armor and his hair, but she wouldn't let go. He caught her legs to hold her on his back, and she could see the corner of a big smile on his cheeks and feel his shoulders trembling. She was still taken aback by how effortlessly she seemed to get along with Hashirama, playing around and acting like little children. With the ease of a shinobi raised in these woods, Hashirama put on a burst of chakra to move them along at a much faster pace without needing to guide her. Her smile dimmed without Hashirama's direct gaze. Now she could sense Madara's chakra, his anguish, sorrow, and anger. She kept telling herself that Madara had recently lost the last of his brothers, that most of his clan feared him, and that after Izuna's death, they had deserted him to the Senju. She sensed the chakras of Mito, Tobirama, and two more that she didn't recognize. Naruto's eye twitched as she realized that Madara and Tobirama's chakras were as far apart as they could be in the meeting space where they were assembled. Who had the brilliant idea to place those two close to one another and leave Mito as their mediator? Naruto paused, thinking about Mito's impression of her ever since they first met. She was frightening enough to possibly cow Madara as well, and she could at least cow Tobirama. She tapped his shoulder as Hashirama began to slow down. At the next branch, he gave up and disappointed her. Silently, she followed him once more. Despite their light-hearted banter, their seriousness increased as they approached Madara. Naruto knew that Hashirama was more nervous about seeing him than she was excited. When they finally arrived in a clearing, she was not prepared. The moment Kurama appeared, his growl reverberated in her mind, but he controlled his temper. Even though Naruto did her best to control her expression, her fists clenched as she fell in front of them, her gaze fixed on Madara. In fact, her shoulders and fists began to relax as she gazed at him. When she landed, Madara had hardly looked at her, glancing at her once before his black eyes locked on Hashirama and remained there. She was able to gaze at him without his direct gaze, which was not an option available to her during her time. He appeared, elderly, and worn out. He had dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises, and lines beneath them that made her think of Itachi. She could see a glimmer of hope, a light in his dark eyes as he gazed at Hashirama, despite the fact that his grief practically hung over him in a physical cloud. While Hashirama shouted a warm greeting to Madara and stepped forward to give him a shoulder clap, ignoring the tensing of the other Uchiha standing behind Madara, Naruto watched Madara warily. She wandered over to Tobirama, Mito, and a strange shinobi with bright red hair standing there. Red-eyed and tense, Tobirama stared at Madara and his brother. They were all staring at Madara, but he gave her a quick look and a slight lift of his lips in acknowledgement. Hashirama had drawn him in, and they were speaking in a low voice that was too quiet for them to hear. Madara appeared tired but optimistic, and Hashirama appeared pleased and sincere. As long as Kurama was in her line of sight, his growl would reverberate in her mind, and she made every effort to ignore him. Naruto looked over at the new Uzumaki. While she had been at the Senju clan, she had been forbidden to see anyone else, and although a few people had heard about her, she had never met them. She trusted him to be her right hand while she negotiated on behalf of the Uzumaki and with the truth about what she carried, as Mito had claimed to be her cousin. "Hi, I'm Namikaze Naruto." He gave her a smile. Although he was taller than Mito and her, he was not as tall as Madara, Tobirama, or even Hashirama. She was beginning to believe that Uzumaki were simply cursed with their diminutive stature. His shoulder-length bright red hair was pulled back in a short ponytail, with a lock of bangs braided on the right side and held in place by a tiny blue bead that appeared to have delicate engraving work that was difficult for her to see. "I'm Uzumaki Jiro. I hear you're a long-lost relative." She gave a nod. "Yup, seems that way. Nice to meet you, little cousin," he said with a smile and a head tilt. "Naruto," Hashirama exclaimed, cutting short any response she might have had and gesturing for her to come closer even as he practically pulled Madara ahead. "Let me officially introduce you. Madara, this is Namikaze Naruto, a recently discovered distant relation of the Uzumaki clan. Naruto, this is Uchiha Madara, clan head of the Uchiha." Madara looked directly at Naruto for the first time. She anticipated being viewed as a possible threat, similar to how Tobirama and Hashirama had responded when they first met her, and she was aware that he had been told about the fox's chakra in her body. As she looked into his eyes, her fingers twitched nervously at the hem of her shirt and then clenched tensely at her sides. Remembering her largely non-existent manners, she forced herself to smile and bow slightly at the waist, reminding herself that she wasn't supposed to know this Madara. "Hi, nice to meet you officially. Hashirama's told me a lot about you." Madara's eyes scanned her entire body from head to toe as she heard a slight hum. Although he didn't initially return her greeting, he tipped his head in acknowledgement. "So you're the girl I've heard so much about." His tone didn't sit well with her. She narrowed her eyes at him, feeling her hackles rise. "Yes," she said slowly, focusing on the word's hiss and how she pronounced it. "You don't have red hair." Really, her hair, out of everything he could say when he first met her. "Not that she's holding the chakra of a Biju." "No, I don't." Madara's gaze shifted to Mito and back again. "And you've had no formal training. You were taught by a wandering shinobi with no clan, correct?" She didn't like his tone at all now. "I see." It was practically brimming with the arrogance Sasuke used to speak when they were younger. As she battled with herself to avoid reacting the same way she did with Sasuke, her fists became even more clenched, and her nails dug crescents into her palms. "Yes." Madara turned to Hashirama after giving her one last broad look. Are you ready to begin? The eyes of Naruto seemed to pop out of her head. Did he simply ignore her? Was that all he was going to ask her, all he was going to say about his reaction to her? Following all that he did to her, all the fighting, sending her here, and this is it? Slow down. Kurama gave her a stern look. At this moment, would you prefer to have his undivided attention? Allow him to continue his Hashirama obsession. Her temper was swiftly calmed by that. She recalled how intensely Madara used to focus on her during her lifetime. She could manage herself better when his attentions finally shifted if she had more time to gather herself, form relationships, and even watch him without his focus. It wasn't until a tiny wooden building was forcing itself out of the ground in front of them that she realized she had tuned out. It was much smoother and formed much faster than Yamato's Mokuden Jutsu. In order to guarantee their safety and the impossibility of overhearing any conversations, Mito and Jiro swiftly went around the building and placed ceiling tags. She wasn't looking forward to this part. She wasn't a member of the clan, despite being an Uzumaki, so she wasn't really permitted to be in the same room as them as they discussed terms. Even the majority of the conversation about her would exclude her. She would be informed when she was expected to demonstrate her control, but she would once more be excluded and denied the opportunity to listen in on their conversation. She wouldn't be trapped inside, thankfully. When Jiro and Mito had finished securing the structure, Hashirama created a wood clone. As long as she didn't go too far, she was essentially free to hang out outside, though the clone would keep an eye on her. Additionally, Tobirama's senior skills would serve as a backup to monitor her location. She would still enjoy her time outside even though it was yet another act of faith and test she would pass. At least she had gained enough respect and trust to be allowed to be outside alone. She had had enough of being cooped up inside for the rest of her life, but there was also a separate room if she wanted to wait inside. Naruto, we'll call you in when we're done for the day. We'll try not to take too long, Hashirama replied. She gave a nod. Watching Madara and Tobirama distracted her a little. Even if she didn't look at them directly, she could almost see the tension between them without Hashirama to divert their attention. They were both hovering around the building, but neither was approaching it. She attracted Mito's attention, and the older woman rolled her eyes before approaching Tobirama and extending her arm. Tobirama stared down at Mito, and she suppressed a snort at the expression on his face. Then, with a sigh, he took her arm, put it in his elbow, and ushered her inside. As he followed, Jiro's gaze fell on her, and he gave her a wink. Madara leaned back against the wall by the door and watched them, waving his clansmen inside, Tobirama out of sight. She couldn't help but curl her lip reflexively as she briefly met his eyes. Despite her sympathy for his loss, she was still furious with him for dismissing her and for everything he had done during her time. Since she was a new genin, she hadn't been written off so readily. In fact, Madara appeared shocked by her animosity, but he then glared at her, his eyes flashing a faint shade of red. As Kurama's growl intensified, Naruto maintained eye contact with the silent threat. She knew he was bluffing. In reality, he would not harm her in any way, particularly in this situation with Hashirama. Speaking of, despite the fact that he was hardly exerting any pressure, she instantly hunched beneath the warm hand that touched her shoulder. I'll meet you inside, Madara. I just need to have a quick word with Naruto here. Madara gave her a gloomy glance before turning to head inside after nodding. She stuck her tongue out at him, behaving like the responsible adult she was. He appeared more puzzled than irritated, as she had anticipated. His clansman put a hand on Madara's shoulder and pulled at him, his dark brown hair pulled up in a ponytail and bangs hanging around his face. Madara stared at her for a moment before following. She was unable to read his face, and she was unable to sense any other emotions from him because his chakra was still too heavily layered with grief. When he was out of sight, Kurama's growl ceased to exist in her mind. She recalled that Hashirama was present when he cleared his throat. Since he had asked her to give Madara a chance, she thought he would be irritated with her, but instead he was grinning subtly. Her head was tilted. What? Still grinning, he shook his head and turned to face the cabin, which Madara had already entered. I haven't seen him act like that since the battle. She sighed. Act like what? A dismissive jerk. Hashirama chuckled. No, that's normal for him. But you've gotten more emotion out of him than I've seen since his brother died. I think you distracted him with your childish behavior. She gave him a skeptical look, and you don't have any preconceived ideas about him. His standing with his clan is rocky. She scowled and remarked, he seemed happy about seeing you, because they were afraid of Madara. She had heard of Uchiha members turning themselves into the Senju. She concealed a grimace as well. She was undoubtedly not a fan of Madara, but if Hashirama wasn't suspicious, at least she was getting better at acting. After trailing off, Hashirama sighed. I know he is, in a way, Buddha Yuro. We made this dream to protect our family, our brothers. I don't know if Madara will ever truly get over Izuna's death. And whatever feelings he may have regarding me, as it stands, his brother is dead and Minya Yuro. Yours is alive. And killed his. Hashirama gave a nod. I'm hoping when we get this village built, he will come to see it as his family, and that it will help him start to heal, but right now he's almost drowning. Whispering, I know, she grimaced. She could still feel the storm of his feelings. Hashirama's eyebrow went up. Hashirama made a hand gesture that she took to be a reference to Kurama, saying, oh, right. You can feel negative emotions because of a Yuro. With a nod, Naruto extended his hand to give him a gentle shove on the shoulder. He made no pretense of being moved by her. Don't count yourself out. He actually felt a little better when we arrived and you talked to him. He cares for you on some level, and he is hopeful for this village of yours to work out. He seemed to feel lighter after she said, that's good to hear. This village is our first step to peace, and I want him to believe in it like we used to. What surprised Naruto more was how readily he believed her. Well, you better get inside then, so this village can be built soon, she replied. Hashirama gave a nod. You're going to spend some time out here, right? Yeah. I've had enough of being cooped up. I can explore a little bit, right? The clone of Hashirama, whom she had honestly forgotten about, appeared. Yeah, you can wander around a bit. There's a river not too far. It's where Madara and I met as kids. My clone will tell you when we're done, and he'll also tell you when you've gone out too far. Hearing the silent warning, she nodded. This time, he allowed her to push him forward after she shoved him. I get it. Now go inside and make peace. I promise I won't go far. I'll try to keep this meeting from going too long, he replied. With a final click, the cabin door closed behind him, leaving Naruto alone with the background sounds of insects and birds. Naruto inhaled deeply and simply relaxed in the sun for a while. She was smiling when she opened her eyes, and she cheerfully jumped into the trees, with Hashirama's clone trailing behind. She enjoyed the opportunity to run around largely alone and use her chakra while performing tricks and flips in the branches. When she noticed an older tree that was taller and thicker than the others nearby, she stopped. On a lower branch, she paused and gazed up at the canopy of leaves above her. She slowly began to climb after reaching up with her hand to the nearest branch. On the tree beside her, Hashirama's clone came to a halt. What are you doing? She grunted as she felt her foot slip, asking, when's the last time you climbed a tree without using chakra? Katake and Jiraiya both helped me with chakra control exercises, but both would always physically test themselves, too. Katake would tie a hand behind his back and climb trees or cliffs, just to keep challenging himself. Huh, said the clone. Then, when she growled, he leapt onto her tree and used his chakra to ascend to the top, throwing a Grian down at her. Naruto continued climbing, relishing the difficulty of locating sturdy enough branches and footholds as she ascended the tree. She had laughed when she first witnessed Kakashi Sensei doing this, followed the clone's lead, and used her chakra to pass him. Leaning over the top of the cliff he was climbing, she had used one hand to watch him ascend. It wasn't until Kakashi had gotten to the top, slapped her in the head, and challenged her to climb without chakra with both hands to Yuro. He would do it again with his hand still T to Yuro. That she truly realized why he was pushing himself. She had jumped to the bottom to start the climb and then been thoroughly thrashed because she could never resist a challenge. Climbing without chakra was difficult both mentally and physically because she had to look around to find her next grip and would fall if she made a mistake. In some respects, shinobi were so reliant on their chakra that they neglected basic physical skills because they were accustomed to using it to make up for their limitations. It was pleasant to spend time with Kakashi, and she had begun to accompany him on the occasional climb when they both had free time. When they climbed, he would occasionally become playful and competitive, and it was always difficult to resist him. She slapped at the clone's dangling foot, which rested on a branch that shouldn't have been able to support his weight, as she got to the top of the tree. She sensed his chakra being used, and he was cheating because he was a wood clone. Was that satisfying? I heard you slip a few times on the way up, the replica replied. Naruto nodded as she struggled against the pull of the wind and gravity, relishing the stretch of effort in her arms. She estimated that it was just before noon based on her observation of the sun abruptly reminded of the mission to wave and cling to the top of a tree like this with Sasuke. She clung to what branches she could reach. She sighed, gazing out at the treetops surrounding her, the mood sufficiently soured. The river Hashirama had mentioned was winding through the trees, and she could see the sun's glistening blue. Her breath caught in her chest as she looked over her shoulder. The cliff that would become the Hokage monument rose through the trees behind her. She realized she was truly home as she surveyed her surroundings with fresh eyes. The village would be located where she was, and hopefully Konoha would be constructed there in a few days. It was only now that she truly realized where she was, even though she knew they were meeting near the site of the village's construction. The clone of Hashirama followed her eyes. Madara and I would race to the top of it when we were young. This is where we want to build our village, the replica said cautiously. You're not going to try climbing that, are you? She gave a headshake. Not yet, I want to just sit here a bit. Hashirama broke the silence that had returned. You know, technically, you're not sitting on anything. Shut it. Hours were being spent on the meeting. The midday meal was over. After a while, she leapt from the tree and headed to the river, where she caught a fish to eat for lunch. Since Hashirama didn't know any kaiden and didn't feel like making one, her clone made her a fire. She had food in her belly and was able to spend time outside doing what she wanted, but he gave her a hard time for it, especially after the whole tree climbing incident. At last she had conceded and gone to the precipice. She used chakra to climb it, but she had taken an almost leisurely pace up the side, stopping whenever there was a large enough rock outcropping for her to sit on. This allowed her to turn and gaze out over the trees, visualizing her Konoha. She was upset and homesick by the time she got to the top. The people who knew her and brought her here, away from her friends, were Obito, Madara, Hashirama, and Tobirama. She was upset with them. She remembered Iruka reprimanding her as she was cleaning off the paint, and she longed to see him, especially when she got to the part where the heads would be carved. When she requested to spar, the clone watched her anxiously, and she could sense that the clone was holding back as she used taijutsu to vent. The spar had been a while ago, and Naruto had relaxed, relieved that Hashirama's clone hadn't bothered her. As it grew later, she sat with her feet hanging over the edge, watching the sun begin its descent. Even though her fingers were red, she nibbled on some berries she had discovered, savoring the juice and flavor explosions. Behind her, Hashirama's clone lay flat on the ground. He had just sat and watched her after the spar. She had no idea how Hashirama's wood clones operated, but her abrupt change in mood would undoubtedly be noticed. Only Mito could rationally comprehend her at this moment, so she wouldn't know how to respond if they asked. The clone of Hashirama sat up abruptly. They've finished. They're coming here. Madara and myself are familiar enough with the area that if you lose control, they're confident of containing you. She blinked. Officially, the time had come. Kurama, are you ready? In her mind, he changed. She could almost see him standing up and settling his shoulders. Let's finish this. You should leave Madara as soon as possible. As they all drew closer to her, she sensed their chakra. Do they want to do it up here or down there? After a moment of silence, the clone responded. Meet them down there. If you lose control, they can use the cliff. Naruto inhaled deeply, mentally preparing herself as the clone vanished. She looked down when she sensed that everyone was waiting right below her. The two that stood out the most to her were Tobirama and Mito, whose hair colors she could hardly see. As she always did as a child, she summoned her chakra and then pushed herself off the cliff, allowing her hair to fly up and fall freely for a moment. She didn't try to slow her descent or catch herself on the cliff, but she could feel the spikes from Tobirama and Hashirama. She smiled as she concentrated on building wind chakra, encircling her body with a layer, and feeling herself slow down as she fell so she could catch herself. She rolled when she hit the ground to release her momentum. As she landed, a gust of wind followed her, causing the group in front of her to stumble a euro. Something she knew they only did because they hadn't been prepared for it. She had learned this trick at Mount Myoboku after falling from those damned spikes too many times. Tobirama finally gave her a name for the unique way she had always used her wind nature. She had discovered that by applying wind chakra to her body, she could change the airflow around her. To be honest, it was like walking on water. She used the air around her to slow or cushion her body in the air, matching her chakra to the flow of the water to walk on. When she fell from a height, she could either release a gust of air to cushion her body from the landing or slow herself down until she felt as though she was just floating. She didn't realize how uncommon that type of use must be until she heard from Tobirama. The dirt had flown up around them, and she stood up, waving a hand in front of her face to spread it. Naruto grimaced as a few of the others coughed lightly. The dirt cleared as she swung her arm, sending another gust of wind. They were all in front of her, Madara and Tobirama at either end, Mito and Hashirama in the middle, and Jiro and the Uchiha, whose name she never knew, standing directly behind them. The hair of Madara and Hashirama was still flying all over them, and she bit her lip to keep from smiling. She was failing, judging by the glare Madara gave her while he shook out some dirt. Sorry about that, I didn't think that through. She was being eyed by Hashirama. I see what Tobirama meant now, with your wind nature. She shrugged and looked at the white-haired Senju. Her lips quirked again at the fact that his hair was more brown, but then he shook his hand through it. I didn't realize it was something so strange until after he explained it to me, she said. He glared at her with bright red eyes, but he appeared impressed. Madara remarked, "It's not strange, just rare." She tensed up, looking back at him. With his arms folded across his chest, he was observing her after brushing the majority of the dirt off of himself. She wondered what they had all discussed over the last few hours since she could feel a different weight to his gaze. "I'd prefer not to have his attention," you said. "Kid, it's too late for that now. He won't be forgetting or dismissing you anytime soon," Kurama growled, sounding as pleased as she was by his statement. "That little display, plus what we're getting ready to do." "Well, I'm as ready for this as I can be. Are you all ready?" she said. All of their body language changed. With the exception of Mito, everyone stiffened and braced their feet. Only Mito knew she was in complete control, but she could feel their chakra rising just beneath the surface, ready to be called upon if they needed to stop her. Naruko extended her arm to Mito as she stepped forward. Her chakra signature was concealed by a single finger tracing down the sealwork, which also prevented her from fully accessing her reserves. The seal flared red and then disappeared with a flare of Mito's chakra. She noticed that Madara's chakra had changed, that she was becoming more cautious, and that he hadn't truly sensed her chakra during their previous encounter. He could finally sense her reserve and, based on his expression, realized she was a genuine threat. As his eyes bled red and his Sharingan formed, she stared into his eyes without flinching, using his keener vision to analyze her chakra. "Kumara, it's time to begin."
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.